As evening drew near, a dusty rider on a tall bay stallion approached a lone tavern on the northeastern road. The traveler tossed the reins to a young stable boy, who rushed up to him and stepped onto the creaky porch. A broad cloak, hanging in loose folds, concealed most of his lean, broad-shouldered frame, though the silhouette of a sword on his left hip was unmistakable. Thick chestnut hair, woven into a long braid down his back, along with his beard and mustache, marked him as a member of one of the many mercenary groups that had spread across the Russian Empire over the past decade. Yet the deep, dark, violet eyes, shimmering with emerald flecks, and the fine features of his face unmistakably revealed a noble heritage from the highest bloodlines of Caleron. Dressed in gaiters and a skirt, he might have passed for someone from Akgiriel, far from these northern Uriel foothills in the rural eastern province of Rosha. At the door, the traveler glanced back to see the servant leading his horse into a small, weathered stable with a shingle roof. The animal balked, pulling back and trying twice to tug the reins free from unfamiliar hands. A quiet but firm command from its master soon settled the steed. An observant onlooker, noting the quiver of arrows and the bow strapped to what was once a fine saddle, would surely recognize in this newcomer a figure known across both sides of the Alban Mountains throughout East and West Rosha, Paynor, the Free Duchies, Zbedosh, the land of the Kaisaks, beyond the Silver Mountains and along the coast of the Central Sea, Brent the Archer, eternal outcast and wanderer, mercenary and adventurer. Bending his head to avoid hitting the low lintel, Brent stepped into a grimy, poorly lit room with 4 rough wooden tables. Reddish reflections from the fire, where the innkeeper was busy roasting something that might have been a small ram or perhaps a large mongrel, illuminated 2 of the 4 tables, which were already occupied. At one table sat 3 traders hawking everyday goods in the local villages. A hefty jug of beer and 3 mugs sat in front of them. Across from them sat a man in a dark cloak, under which glinted a richly embroidered garment of southern style, his head crowned with a white turban adorned by a peacock feather. Brent couldn't catch a clear look at his face, for the man sat with his head low, seemingly searching for something at the bottom of his wine cup. One quick glance was all Brent needed to confirm that this tavern was no different from the hundreds like it scattered along Roshan's roads. He took a seat at an empty table with his back to the wall and his face toward the room. An instinctive action born of years of habit, shrugged off his cloak, revealing a coat of chainmail made of silvery gray metal forged by the short-statured, reclusive folk in distant caverns beneath eastern Uriel, almost at the edge of the world. Placing his slender, slightly curved sword in its scabbard beside his cloak, he called out to the innkeeper, "A pitcher of wine and a leg of lamb." The innkeeper briefly paused from his task, nodded to acknowledge the order, but made no hurry to fulfill it. Strangely, it was the man in the turban who reacted to Brent's voice far more eagerly. He jumped from his seat and strode firmly toward the archer's table. Seeing the lavish hilt of a sword, likely a curved saber crafted from Kifiat steel, beneath the stranger's cloak, Brent moved his right hand closer to his own sword. But before the man reached him, a sudden flare from the fire cast bright light on his face. Brent let out a joyful exclamation, standing to greet the approaching figure. There was no mistaking it. This was Obadon, the Sultan of Zbedosh, a small independent nation to the south. Or rather, the former Sultan, for the intrigues of Zbedosh's high priest had finally succeeded just a year and a half ago. Following a palace coup, Obadon had been forced to flee both his capital and his country, where a generous bounty now hung over his head. Officially, the throne had passed to his young, feeble-minded nephew, while the nation was ruled by the Council of Priests, led by High Priest Muskalat the Black. Muskalat's ambitions, however, had only been partially fulfilled. Obadon was alive, brimming with undiminished optimism, and had sworn on the blade of an ancient dagger, an heirloom from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather, that he would use it to spill both the rotten guts of the high priest and his foul black blood. Brent and the Sultan of Zabedosh had crossed paths many times in their travels across the continent, forming a deep mutual respect. Now they embraced joyfully in the dim, dirty hall of the rural inn, much to the relief of the traders who, anticipating a brawl, had begun glancing toward the door. Obadon moved his wine pitcher over to Brent's table and, grinning broadly, proposed a toast to their happy reunion. Brent drained his cup with pleasure, while the Zabadoshian, merely sipping his own, grimaced and shook his head in disappointment. "Obadon, don't you like the wine here?" Brent asked, amused. "How can you drink this swill? It's vinegar mixed with dragon's bile. Anyone who's tasted the 30-year-old wine from my cellars in Azram, harvested from the southern slopes of Mount Ahat in that year, when the drought shriveled the land and people slit each other's throats for a sip of water, wouldn't dare touch this rot without shuddering. Sorry, I've never had the honor of tasting the grape juice from the Sultan's palace cellars, but this wine is no worse than the sour stuff they serve weary travelers in the taverns of your capital, and I've seen enough of those taverns, trust me. I think I'll have another cup if you don't mind." Brent refilled his cup, gesturing for Obadon to join him. "You know my friend Azram is far away, and I can certainly finish this vessel. My first decree upon reclaiming the throne will be, O Brent, a law enforcing the death penalty for any tavern keeper serving bad wine and making weary travelers wait hours for their roast." Obadon's last words were spoken a bit louder than the start of his speech, and he even pounded his fist on the table. No sooner had the sounds of his voice faded than the innkeeper magically appeared beside the table with a deep plate filled with hot roasted meat, drowning in thick gravy. He set the dish down, added 2 flatbreads, and placed bunches of basil and parsley on the side for good measure. Brent pulled a handful of copper coins from the leather pouch fastened to his belt, but did not hurry to hand them over. Looking into the innkeeper's honest, loyal eyes, he said, "Tell me, my good man, is this luxurious dinner perhaps courtesy of the fact that in the last 2 villages I passed, I didn't see a single dog? And come to think of it, I didn't notice any barking or yapping here in your yard either." A mix of fear, confusion, and surprise flooded the good man's face so genuinely that neither Brent nor Obadon could hold back a thunderous laugh. "Just a joke," Brent managed to say through his laughter, "though it's still suspicious. Here, take your copper. You'll get twice as much if you bring us another pitcher of wine and a couple of candles. It's as dark in here as a demon's stomach." "There are no candles, noble sir," the innkeeper muttered. "Then bring a bowl of tallow, at least, and make it quick." Without speaking, Brent and Obadon pulled out their daggers. Brent's was a plain, narrow blade with a bone handle, while the Sultan of Zabedosh's was a curved, wide blade with mysterious symbols along its edge and a deep blood groove, a nightmare in the dreams of Muskalat the Black. Though they only needed their weapons to carve the meat, the sight of their glinting steel made the innkeeper hurry as fast as their laughter had chased him off. After a hearty laugh, they dug into the roast, which, as it turned out, was a decent leg of lamb. They washed it down with great gulps of wine, and Obadon seemed to forget the disgust it had previously inspired in him on an empty stomach. Brent leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the meal settle comfortably within him. The crackling fire cast a warm glow over the dim tavern, and the shadows danced along the rough-hewn walls. Abaddon was recounting tales of his adventures in distant lands, but Brent's thoughts drifted to a recent encounter that still weighed heavily on his mind. It was not long ago that rumors had reached Brent's ears about a notorious bandit terrorizing the old forest road that wound through the dense woods of eastern Uriel. Merchants spoke in hushed tones of a phantom who struck without warning, leaving shattered wagons and lifeless bodies in his wake. The bandits' attacks were becoming more frequent, and fear gripped the hearts of those who relied on the road for trade. Determined to put an end to the menace, Brent set out to track down the elusive outlaw. The forest was vast, a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled underbrush that seemed to swallow the light. The canopy above was so thick that even at midday, the sun's rays barely pierced through, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Brent moved silently through the woods, his senses attuned to every sound and movement. Days turned into nights as he followed the faintest traces. A broken branch here, a footprint in soft mud there. The bandit was cunning, leaving little evidence of his passage. But Brent was patient, and his years of experience as a tracker served him well. On the third day, he came upon the remnants of a recent ambush. A caravan lay in ruins, wagons overturned and goods scattered about. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the ground was stained with blood. Brent examined the scene carefully. The attack had been swift and brutal, executed with precision. The merchants and their guards had stood little chance. He found tracks leading away from the site, footprints that were deeper than usual, suggesting the bandit was carrying heavy loot. Brent followed the trail, which led deeper into the forest, away from the main road. The path became more treacherous, the undergrowth thicker and the silence more oppressive. As night fell, Brent decided to set up a discreet camp. He chose a spot beneath a large oak tree, its branches providing some cover. Building a small, smokeless fire, he warmed himself and ate a modest meal. His thoughts remained focused on the pursuit. The bandit was no ordinary thief. His tactics and the ferocity of his attacks indicated training and skill. The next morning, Brent continued his pursuit. The tracks were fresher now, and he felt he was gaining ground. By midday, he noticed the forest began to change. The trees were older, their trunks wider, and the air grew cooler. It was as if he had entered a different realm within the woods. Suddenly, he caught sight of movement ahead, a fleeting shadow darting between the trees. Brent crouched low, his hand instinctively reaching for his bow. He nocked an arrow and waited, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the bandit. Minutes passed, but there was no further movement. Proceeding cautiously, Brent advanced toward where he had seen the shadow. He came upon a small clearing, and at its center stood a crude hut made of branches and leaves. Smoke curled lazily from a hole in the roof. Brent's heart quickened. He had found the bandit's lair. He circled the clearing silently, observing the hut from different angles. There was no sign of sentries or traps, but he knew better than to underestimate his opponent. Deciding on a direct approach, Brent moved to the edge of the clearing and called out, "Bandit, I know you're there. Show yourself." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door of the hut swung open, and a tall figure emerged. The bandit was clad in dark leather armor, a hood concealing his features. In his hand he held a long sword that gleamed even in the dim light. "So the hunter finally reveals himself," the bandit said, his voice calm and steady. Brent stepped forward, his sword drawn but held loosely at his side. Your reign of terror ends here. Surrender now, and perhaps mercy will find you." The bandit laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Mercy? From you? I've heard of Brent the Archer. They say you're relentless, that you never let your quarry escape." "I give you this one chance," Brent replied. "Lay down your weapon." The bandit's posture shifted ever so slightly, a subtle signal that Brent recognized all too well. Without warning, the bandit lunged forward, closing the distance between them with startling speed. Brent parried the initial strike, the clash of steel ringing out through the forest. What followed was a flurry of attacks and counters. The bandit's skill was exceptional. His movements were precise, his strikes powerful. Brent found himself on the defensive, forced to give ground as he sought an opening. The terrain offered little advantage, the uneven ground and roots threatening to trip them both. They fought their way across the clearing and into the trees. The bandit used the environment to his benefit, maneuvering Brent into positions where his footing was unstable. A swift kick from the bandit caught Brent in the ribs, sending a jolt of pain through his side. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the injury slow him down. Brent feigned a stumble, luring the bandit into overextending. As the bandit brought his sword down in a powerful overhead strike, Brent sidestepped and delivered a swift cut to the bandit's sword arm. The blade sliced through leather and flesh, and the bandit hissed in pain. But the wound seemed only to enrage him. Switching his sword to his other hand, the bandit renewed his assault with even greater ferocity. Brent was taken aback. Few could wield a sword so effectively with their offhand. He realized now that this opponent was not merely skilled, but ambidextrous, a rare and dangerous trait. The duel pressed on, both men tiring but neither willing to yield. Sweat dripped down Brent's brow, his muscles burning from exertion. He knew he couldn't keep this up indefinitely. He needed to find a way to end the fight. As they clashed again, Brent noticed a slight hesitation in the bandit's movements. A fraction of a second where his guard dropped. It was a small flaw, but it was enough. Summoning his remaining strength, Brent launched a series of rapid strikes, pushing the bandit back toward a large tree. Sensing the trap, the bandit tried to break away, but Brent anticipated the move. He feinted to the right, then lunged to the left, driving his shoulder into the bandit's chest. The impact sent the bandit stumbling backward, and he tripped over an exposed root, falling hard to the ground. Brent wasted no time. He kicked the bandit's sword out of reach and pressed the tip of his own blade against the man's throat. The bandit glared up at him, defiance burning in his eyes. "Do it!" the bandit spat. "Finish it!" Brent hesitated. Killing in battle was one thing. Executing a disarmed opponent was another. He considered bringing the bandit to the nearest town to face justice, but he knew the journey back was long and fraught with danger. There was also the risk of the bandit escaping and continuing his reign of terror. Steeling himself, Brent made his decision. With a swift motion, he ended the bandit's life. A heavy silence settled over the forest, broken only by the distant call of a bird. Brent sheathed his sword and took a moment to catch his breath. He searched the bandit's belongings, finding trinkets and valuables taken from his victims. Among them was a pendant bearing the crest of the Roshan Empire, a clue that the bandit might have once been a soldier. Brent wondered what had led the man down this dark path, but knew that such questions would remain unanswered. Gathering the stolen items, Brent resolved to return them to their rightful owners if possible. He dismantled the hut, setting fire to the remnants to prevent it from becoming a haven for other outlaws. As the flames consumed the structure, Brent felt a sense of closure. The journey back to civilization was long and arduous. Brent's wound needed tending, and the weight of what he had done weighed heavily upon him. Yet he knew that his actions had saved lives, and restored a measure of safety to the region. Upon reaching the nearest town, he delivered the recovered goods to the local authorities and informed them that the forest road was safe once more. The townsfolk expressed their gratitude, offering him food and lodging, but Brent declined. His path lay elsewhere, and there was always more work to be done. Back in the tavern, Brent's reverie was broken by Obadon's hearty laugh. The Sultan was gesturing animatedly, his eyes alight as he recounted a daring escape from a rival's palace. Brent smiled faintly, appreciating the moment of camaraderie. As the evening wore on, the conversation between Brent and Obadon turned to tales of their past adventures. Obadon leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the fire. "You seem distant tonight, my friend," Obadon observed, lost in thought. Brent sighed softly. "I was just recalling an encounter I had recently, a bandit who had been plaguing the forest road near here." "Ah, the perils of travel," Obadon mused. "Did you deal with him?" "I did," Brent replied, "but it was not without difficulty. He was a formidable opponent, skilled, cunning. It reminded me that not all threats come from monsters or dark creatures. Sometimes the greatest dangers are those who walk among us." Obadon nodded thoughtfully. "True words. Men can be as treacherous as any beast, but it's good that you prevailed. The roads are safer because of it." Brent glanced at the window, where the sky was beginning to take on hues of deep purple and indigo. "I suppose. Yet, I can't help but wonder what drives a person to such ends." "Power, greed, desperation," Obadon offered. "The world is full of temptations and pitfalls. But it's up to men like us to stand against them." Brent smiled wryly. "Ever the optimist." Obadon chuckled. "One must be, in times like these." A comfortable silence settled between them. The tavern had grown quieter, the other patrons having retired for the night. The fire had burned low, and the shadows in the room stretched long. Brent's thoughts drifted once more, this time to the broader journey ahead. The road was unpredictable, filled with unseen challenges. But he felt a renewed sense of purpose. There were still wrongs to be righted, people to protect, and perhaps even mysteries to unravel. "The night grows late," Obadon remarked, rising from his seat. "We should rest. Who knows what tomorrow will bring?" Brent nodded in agreement. "Indeed. A good night's sleep would do us both well." They settled their tab with the tavern keeper, who seemed relieved that no further excitement had occurred. Climbing the creaky stairs to their modest rooms, they bid each other good night. Lying on his straw-filled mattress, Brent stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a symphony he knew well. Sleep came slowly, but eventually he drifted into a dreamless slumber. The sun had long since sunk behind the distant forest, casting the sharp peaks of the Alban Mountains in a crimson glow. Through the small, slit-like window, they could see the massive, deathly pale form of the elder sister moon rising above the mountains. With a bowl of burning tallow and a fresh pitcher of wine, the innkeeper returned. He shuffled across the room with strange, almost stiff steps and set the items down in front of the friends. As Brent handed over a few more copper coins, he noticed an unnatural gleam in the innkeeper's beady little eyes. "Hey, friend," he called out. "Have you had a bit too much while filling up our pitcher?" "No, I haven't," the innkeeper replied, his voice low and with a rare boldness that made both men flinch. "How dare you speak to my friend that way?" Obadon's voice rose, but the innkeeper ignored him, turning on stiff legs and walking away. Outraged by such disrespect, Obadon started to rise, intending to teach the man a lesson, but Brent leaned over the table and held him back. "Wait, he's either insane or—" He never got the chance to finish. With a loud, inhuman roar, the innkeeper tore open his rough homespun shirt and dropped to all fours. Everyone in the room leapt up, watching the transformation in horror. As the innkeeper's scream turned into a beastly howl, his body became covered in thick, matted brown fur. His fingers shortened, his nails grew into long, curved black claws, and his face stretched and morphed, transforming into a creature's snout. "A werewolf," Obadon whispered, his lips pale, while Brent made a protective sign with his fingers to ward off evil. The terrifying creature, something between a massive wolf and a bear, stood in the middle of the room, bracing itself on a pile of tattered clothes that moments before had been the innkeeper's attire. Its red eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, shifted from one patron to another, and from its half-open maw, revealing teeth as long as a man's finger, hot saliva dripped onto the floor. A tense silence fell over the room, broken only by a low, guttural growl. Suddenly, a horse neighed wildly and thrashed in the stable. Brent started, recognizing the voice of his own stallion, and drew his sword. Arendir, the blade of an elven prince, quivered and vibrated, as it always did in the presence of dark creatures. Out of the corner of his eye, Brent saw that the Sultan of Zbedosh had unsheathed his curved saber made of Kifiot steel and was stepping backward, angling himself so that the heavy oak table stood between him and the monster. So far, their survival depended on a fragile calm, though it was more like a frozen shock, brought on by a mix of fear and surprise. The werewolf, standing in the center of the room, seemed as indecisive as a donkey caught between two bales of hay, unsure of which group of people to attack first. But just then, the nerves of one of the merchants gave way under the strain. With a loud, almost shrill scream, he bolted for the door. His companions, overtaken by panic, hurried after him. Their commotion spurred the beast into action. In 2 leaps, the werewolf crossed the distance from the center of the room to the nearest victim, knocking the man flat with a swipe of its clawed paw. He rolled across the floor, clutching his shoulder, which had turned into a bloody mess of flesh, muscle, and shreds of clothing. The beast did not stop, but leapt on to the next man, snapping its powerful jaws at his skull, which cracked with a savage twist of its neck. The merchant's head separated from his body, flying through the air and spraying blood everywhere before landing with a dull thud and rolling forward to stare lifelessly at Brent and Obadon with wide, dead eyes. The monster took even less time with the third man than the previous 2. Now, already turning toward the friends bristling with their drawn swords, it casually slashed its claws across the chest and stomach of the last merchant, who slumped against the doorframe, desperately trying to hold in his spilling intestines. Brent and Obadon exchanged a glance. Their position was certainly better than the butchered merchant's, but it left much to be desired. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pressing their backs against the greasy wall, their weapons raised before them. In front of them was a table with 2 pitchers of wine, a bowl of roasted meat, and a burning lamp. To their right, blocking the only exit to the yard, lay the mutilated bodies of the merchants. Standing over them, its front paws pressing down on the chest of one man, wounded in the shoulder and paralyzed with terror, was the creature. Its fur, matted with blood, clung to its snout, and its eyes burned with a hellish fire. That exit was cut off. Directly in front of the friends was a solid wall, and to the left was a staircase leading to the 2nd floor, where rooms were rented out to travelers. Brent nodded toward the stairs. His companion understood immediately. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. The beast wasn't in a hurry, and neither were they. The horses in the stable continued to whinny and thrash in fear. Amidst the noise, Brent picked up the faint sound of howling from outside. "He's not alone," the archer whispered softly. "Yes, I hear it." "We need to get out before it's too late," Obadon replied. "Before they gather the whole pack," Brent silently completed the thought. The werewolf, disturbed from its trance-like state by the sound of human voices, raised its head and howled loudly at the ceiling. 2 or 3 more howls answered from the yard. Carefully, Brent reached for the lamp with his left hand. The creature growled and moved forward. Brent froze. The beast crouched on its hind legs, tensing as if preparing to pounce. Sensing that there was no more time to wait, Brent quickly grabbed the bowl of burning oil and, just as the creature lunged, he shoved the table toward it with all his strength. The overturned table struck the monster's front legs mid-air, causing it to tumble forward and roll right at the friend's feet. Obadon's saber flashed and struck, though it did little to harm the beast. Then Brent brought the burning lamp down on the creature's grotesque, blood-smeared head. The stench of burning fur made both men squint. The monster let out a horrific roar of pain, charging forward blindly and smashing its head into the wall, where it spun in confusion, disoriented and half-blinded. Wasting no time, the friends crossed the room and ascended the stairs. Obadon slipped through the door first, with Brent close behind. As he glanced back, he saw the werewolf, seemingly recovering from the blow, bounding after them in huge leaps. Brent slammed the door shut, and with no better option for a lock, drove his dagger diagonally into the soft wood, pinning the door firmly to the frame. "This way." Obadon waved from a window at the end of the corridor. Brent ran to him. Right below the window was the roof of the stable, where the terrified horses thrashed and kicked. Leaning slightly out of the window and glancing around, he saw at least 5 creatures prowling the moonlit yard around the inn, similar to the one now battering against the door they'd just escaped through. "What's the plan, Obadon?" "I think we should make our way to the stable roof, get to the horses, and—" "You're right, let's go. I don't think that door will hold for long." "Then I'll go first." Obadon climbed onto the window ledge, but suddenly paused. "Strange," he said, turning to Brent. "I was certain I'd behead it. The strike was precise, but the blade bounced off. This saber is Kifiot steel, and it's never failed me before." "Yes, strange," Brent agreed, glancing down at Arondir, which still vibrated softly in his hand. "But maybe elven craftsmanship will have better luck. In the meantime, let's hurry." Reaching the stable roof proved easier than it initially appeared. As soon as the Sultan's feet touched the roof, the rotten beams gave way with a loud crack, and Obadon fell through the resulting hole. Without hesitation, Brent jumped in after him. Inside the stable, a stifling pitch blackness reigned, broken only by the dim light of the elder sister moon streaming through the hole in the roof. Landing on his feet, Brent saw a writhing mass on the floor. A life-or-death struggle. The stable boy turned as well, flashed through Brent's mind. That's why the horses were so panicked. And now he's after Obadon. As the combatants rolled into the patch of moonlight under the broken roof, Brent saw that Obadon had managed to wedge his saber into the mouth of the smaller, though still vicious, werewolf attacking him. Despite being half the size of the innkeeper beast, it was ferocious. Obadon gripped the saber with both hands, holding the deadly fangs away from his throat. Strangely, though the creature's deadly claws remained a serious threat, they landed hesitant blows to Obadon's chest and stomach, recoiling as if burned each time. Brent had little time to ponder this odd behavior. It was time to test the elven blade on a werewolf. Raising Arendir, he timed his swing carefully and brought the blade down on the creature's nape. To his satisfaction, he saw that his strike found its mark, though it did not achieve the hoped-for results. The beast's head, severed completely from its shoulders, still clenched its jaws around Obadon's saber, its eyes gleaming and swiveling with hatred. The body, thrown aside by a kick from the Sultan, did not collapse lifelessly as expected. Instead, it struggled to rise. Not a drop of blood spilled from the seemingly mortal wound. "Damn it," Obadon muttered through gritted teeth, springing to his feet and jerking the saber out of the creature's mouth with a sharp flick of his wrist. The werewolf's teeth, unable to grip the polished steel, slid off, sending the severed head tumbling into the corner, landing atop a pile of manure. "To the horses, quickly! We can't waste a moment," Brent called out to his companion, as he moved to his stall, calming his steed with a few gentle words and securing a travel saddle to its back. Without hesitation, Obadon followed suit, rushing to his slender black stallion, an expensive import from Vagrant. This horse had once saved its master's life during his escape from Zbedosh. "Why was it afraid to strike you with its claws?" Brent asked, nodding toward the headless creature still twitching in the shadows, as he led his horse from the stall and leapt into the saddle. "To be honest," Obadon replied, swinging his leg into the stirrup, "I don't know. Perhaps it's my chainmail? It's made from the finest Zbedosh silver." Brent now noticed that beneath the tattered remnants of the Sultan's gold-threaded robe lay a silvery white chainmail that clung to Obadon's frame like scales to a fish. "Silver? That could be the answer!" Gently, they soothed their fear-stricken horses and led them toward the stable doors. Through the thin wooden wall, they could hear the angry snarls of half a dozen werewolves, eager for the kill. "Are we ready?" Obadon mouthed. "Ready?" Brent replied. "Especially since—" Whatever he was about to add went unsaid, as the Sultan had already noticed their old foe's bloodied, grotesque snout poking through a hole in the roof, momentarily blocking the moonlight. Without wasting another second, Obadon slashed the wooden bolt with his saber and threw the door open. Just as he did, Brent heard the soft thud of a heavy body landing behind him. His horse reared up, kicking out with both hind legs. The hooves struck something alive and solid, but Brent spurred his steed forward, following Obadon as they burst into the open. The Sultan of Zbedosh tore across the yard, clinging low to his horse's neck and brandishing his saber overhead as if it could somehow keep the monsters at bay. Brent urged his own horse to follow, leaning forward and holding Arendir, the elven blade, trembling in his right hand. In mere heartbeats, the distance between the stable and the fence shrank. Brent managed to slice the legs from one werewolf that leapt at him, while Obadon's horse crushed the ribcage of another. One by one, their steeds cleared the 4-foot fence and sped down the moonlit road like a storm. The wolf beasts, unable to match the speed of true wolves on an open road, fell behind after the first 20 yards but continued to pursue with a dogged persistence. Now, urged on by terror, the horses needed to be reined in rather than spurred to conserve their strength for what might be a night-long escape. "Where to now, Archer?" Obadon called out, tugging at the reins to steady his frenzied horse. "North. Straight along this road?" Brent replied, doing the same. 2 hours' hard ride will bring us to the castle of Tan Nicholas. He's an old friend. Stone walls will shelter us better than an elven blade or even a silver chainmail. Their gallop continued. Though the werewolves fell farther behind with each mile, their distant howls pushed the horses to race forward at full speed. Brent and Obadon took turns unbuckling their packs, tossing them onto the road. Gradually, the horses calmed, their frenzied gallop easing into a steady rhythmic pace. Their hooves clattered a merry beat on the granite-paved road laid long ago by the master craftsmen of the Golden Age. Salvation seemed more within reach with each step. Both riders, though exhausted, were confident their steeds could carry them through till dawn. "Should we try hiding in the forest?" Obadon suggested. "Not a good idea. We'd lose speed, and I'm sure the werewolves wouldn't need sight to find us. They could track us by scent. But if we headed into the mountains, we might find an unreachable ledge on a cliff and leave our horses as bait. No, Archer. I won't hide on some rock while my blackie is left as dinner for those mangy beasts. Even a horse doesn't deserve that." "You're right," Brent agreed. "By the scythe of the high priest and the right leg stand of the sacrificial altar. The only way forward is to stay on this road." Suddenly, just before a sharp bend, the horses snorted, danced sideways, and shied away from something moving at the roadside. Something Brent's sharp eyes had first mistaken for a gray, moss-covered boulder. They struggled to control their frightened horses as the boulder rose, taking on the unmistakable form of a cloaked figure with a low hood. "Hey, friend, what kind of joke is this? Best get out of here before things get ugly," Brent called out, his voice hoarse from the tension as he urged his horse toward the stranger despite the animal's wild resistance. The stranger slowly turned to face him and pushed back his hood, revealing a face that could only be described as nightmarish, even after an encounter with werewolves. The horror lay in the fact that the creature's head blended the features of both man and beast. The creature had a high, undeniably intelligent forehead, low black brows, deep-set round eyes, a jutting jaw covered with sparse hair around a thin-lipped mouth, a receding chin, and a nearly flattened nose with deep nostrils. Its lips twisted in a smug grin. The horses reared, then bolted, racing headlong from the terrifying sight. After several wild strides, Brent managed to rein in his stallion, nearly tearing its mouth in the process. He looked back. The mysterious figure still stood in place, slightly tilting its head, exposing gleaming curved fangs in the moonlight. From its throat came a rasping, deathly chuckle. Enraged beyond reason, Brent snatched his bow from his saddle and, drawing the string in one smooth motion, released an arrow aimed at the ghastly figure. What happened next defied all logic. As the arrow flew, the figure raised its arms as if throwing something at its feet, instantly engulfing itself in a cloud of noxious green smoke. The arrow sailed through, undeterred, and embedded itself in the nearest pine tree. As the smoke cleared, all that remained was an empty, level patch of grass by the roadside, with no trace of any living being. Pale with shock, Obadon muttered prayers to every god in the Zbadashian pantheon, calling on all and each in turn. Brent once again murmured a protective spell and touched the silver-clad talisman containing the claw of a white hawk. From around the nearest bend, the ominous howling of the pursuing pack reached them. The friends urged their eager horses forward once more. The following 2 hours, from the hour of the tiger to the hour of the owl, passed like a nightmare. The moonlit road echoed with the pounding of hooves and the heavy breaths of the galloping horses, blending with the howls of the pack that gradually fell behind. Finally, as the silhouette of Tan Nicholas's castle loomed ahead, rising from the rocky cliffs, the howls became barely audible. A short stretch of road and a suspension bridge connected the castle to the main road, spanning a deep chasm. As they approached the bridge's steep ascent, the horses slowed, allowing Brent to assess the situation. The lowered bridge set him on edge. In an area crawling with werewolves, leaving it down at this hour seemed unforgivably reckless. The castle itself was shrouded in darkness, with only the occasional ghostly flicker visible in the arrow slits of the main tower. From that direction came an unsettling, all too familiar noise. As his horse stepped onto the bridge, Brent recognized it. The eerie howls and roars mingled with indistinct human cries. Forgetting everything but the realization that Tan Nicholas and his family were in mortal danger, Brent spurred his horse forward. But the moment he crossed the castle gate, a portcullis crashed down behind him, trapping him inside. From the pitch-black guardroom, 2 gray shadows lunged at him. One werewolf locked its jaws around his horse's neck, while another pounced onto Brent's chest. They both tumbled across the cobblestones of the inner courtyard. Beyond the gate, Abaddon hacked furiously at the steel bars with his Kifiat saber. The beast's jaws clamped down on Brent's shoulder with vice-like strength. Though his chainmail held, his arm was going numb. With his free hand, the archer drew his sword and, plunging it between the creature's hind legs, pulled upward, slashing from belly to chest. Though this inflicted no mortal wound, it left the creature's innards spilling out, tangling its legs. For a brief moment, the beast released its grip on Brent's shoulder to steady itself. That instant was enough for Brent to roll aside, spring to his feet, and strike twice. The first blow sliced the werewolf in half, still fighting against its own entrails, while the second severed the front legs of the creature that had killed his horse. Brent ran to the gate mechanism, hoping to raise the portcullis. The ropes had been gnawed through. "What's going on, Brent? Open the gate!" Abaddon shouted. "It's useless. It's a trap. Get out of here!" "No, I can't leave you." "Listen carefully," Brent said, pressing his face to the bars. "Do you hear the howls from the road?" "I hear them. That's..." "Yes, it's the pack. If they trap you here, it's over. Go while you still can. Lead them away. Dawn is coming. They won't be a threat in the daylight. We'll meet here. Or..." Brent gave a bitter smile. "Somewhere else. Hurry." Reluctantly, the Sultan of Zbedosh turned his horse around. "We'll meet again, archer. We will meet again," he shouted as his black stallion bolted down the road, the pursuing pack snapping at his heels. "I'll find you." Abaddon's last words faded as the wind carried them away. Without waiting for the distant sound of his friend's retreating hoofbeats to fade, Brent sprinted toward the main tower. On the stairs, he encountered 2 human corpses, horribly mutilated, and the body of a werewolf with its skull crushed. "So there is a way to fight them," he thought as he continued upward. At last, Brent arrived at the banquet hall on the tower's 2nd level. The few scattered torches along the walls barely penetrated the darkness, where a swarm of at least 24 werewolves fought, leaped, snarled, and snapped their fanged jaws. At the far end of the hall, on the staircase leading to the 3rd level, stood Tan Nicholas, a sturdy, gray-bearded man of short stature. His eldest son, nearly identical to his father but for a black beard, the captain of the castle guard, and 2 remaining guardsmen. As Brent burst into the hall, the gray wave surged toward the staircase, creating a chaotic melee. All that could be heard were the ragged breaths of men striking with all their strength, the cracking of bones, and the werewolves' snarling growls. And somehow the men managed to hold their ground. The wave of beasts receded, dragging one of the warriors with them, while the heir to the castle dropped to one knee. Wasting not a second more, Brent grabbed a torch from a wall sconce and charged forward. The stunned creatures parted, trying to evade the fiery weapon as it wove a deadly pattern. The torch blazed with bright red flames in his left hand, while Arendir rang out in his right, singing its battle song with unmatched power. Brent slashed with ferocity, hacking off paws, smashing snarling jaws, cracking ribs, and jabbing the torch left and right. Nicholas and his men noticed him and recognized the voice of Arendir. The unexpected help invigorated the defenders of the castle. With a familiar battle cry, the Tan charged forward, just in time as Brent, caught up in his attack, slipped in a pool of blood near the staircase and, falling, was quickly covered by a wave of hairy bodies. As he fell, he struck his head against a step, coming to his senses only to find himself sitting on the upper landing, where Tan Nicholas's strong hand had pulled him to safety. The werewolves had retreated, and the small band of defenders, now missing another man, the captain of the guard, caught a brief respite. "I'm glad you're with us," Nicholas said in a hoarse voice as Brent got to his feet. "Now sheathe your sword. There's only one weapon they fear." Brent took the heavy candelabrum from the Tan's hands. At first he was puzzled, but then all the clues came together in his mind. The werewolf Obadon had fought in the stable hadn't dared touch the Sultan's silver chainmail. And the candelabras, a source of pride for Nicholas, had been cast in the purest silver. The werewolves clearly feared this metal. The battle raged on. The beasts launched another assault. Human hands rose and fell, smashing skulls, breaking spines, crushing ribs. 4, no 3, as the tan sun fell and vanished under a wave of brown backs. Silver candelabras sowed death among the werewolves, who were far more numerous than Brent had initially thought. The situation grew dire. Seeing his son fall, Nicholas recklessly lunged to help, and a beast sank its teeth into his left arm, only to be killed a moment later by the last guard, who was in turn knocked down and torn apart by another creature before Brent's candelabrum dispatched it to the underworld. Nicholas and Brent stepped back simultaneously, pressing their backs against the wall. The Tan's left arm below the elbow was a bloody mess of shattered bone and torn muscle. He breathed heavily, teetering on the brink of shock, as the monstrous creatures regrouped at the base of the staircase, preparing for one final charge. Brent noted with grim satisfaction that fewer than a dozen remained. The candelabras had done their work well. But he harbored no illusions that he and his severely wounded friend could repel even a dozen in such a state. Brent gritted his teeth, prepared to sell his life dearly. Then he noticed that the werewolves were behaving strangely. Instead of launching a coordinated attack to finish off the exhausted humans, they circled in place, whining loudly and somewhat shrilly. Some even edged closer to the exit of the hall. "It's dawn," Nicholas croaked. "What?" Brent didn't understand at first. "Dawn is breaking," the Tan repeated louder. "The spawn of darkness are fleeing. Let's strike and avenge." But with that, Nicholas stumbled forward and collapsed, unconscious, face down on the floor. Brent now noticed the faint first rays of the saving sun filtering through the arrow slits and narrow windows. One by one, the creatures left the hall, retreating to some hidden place where they could transform back into ordinary, unremarkable humans, lying low in that guise until the next night of bloodshed. They would escape whole and unscathed. Brent looked at the mutilated bodies of the men, at Nicholas, barely distinguishable from the dead, recalling the inn, the merchant clutching his spilling entrails, and his companion's head staring lifelessly at the friends with glassy eyes. A wave of cold rage surged within him, drowning out every other emotion. This Brent knew no mercy, no pity. Like a hurricane, he charged at the retreating werewolves, who now thought of neither attack nor defense, driving them from the tower and leaving hairy corpses in his wake. Many of the creatures had already begun their reverse transformation and were utterly helpless before his lethal candelabrum. Finally, a last battle, or rather a slaughter, unfolded before the portcullis trapping Brent, which now became a death trap for his enemies. The last, fully or partially transformed creatures fell on the cobblestones beside the body of his fallen horse. By now, the sun had risen high enough that its rays, touching those who had not fully transformed, completed the process. Those who hadn't reverted to their original form in life regained it in death. Only now did Brent feel the weight of his exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. To ensure the monsters could never rise again, he went through the entire castle, beheading every werewolf that had taken on a human form. Recognizing them was easy enough. None were clothed. Then, gathering the heads in bundles wrapped in his cloak, he carried them in 3 trips to the castle wall and cast them into the deep chasm below. Only after that did he return to Nicholas. The old Tan had regained consciousness and was now trying to stop the blood flowing from the remains of his left forearm. Brent helped him, tightly binding his arm above the elbow with a torn piece of cloth. Nicholas's face was almost as white as his beard. "If only you'd come sooner," he whispered. "Even 2 or 3 days sooner." His chin trembled in silent sobs. "My son, my blood. They killed my heir. They killed me as well." "Stay strong, Nicholas," Brent said. "You'll rest a little now, and we'll treat your wound. It's just a scratch for a warrior like you. We've still got some fighting left in us. Right now, more than anything, I wish I could die," Tan Nicholas replied with a bitter smile. "No, I haven't lost my mind, don't you know? Anyone touched by a werewolf's fangs or claws becomes one themselves." Stunned by this revelation, Brent quickly inspected and felt over all his body parts not protected by chainmail. Praise be to Hortal, there were no wounds. "You see," continued the Tan, "I have a very compelling reason to want death. And I will receive it as punishment for my laziness and inaction. Perhaps even before I can tell you everything. I'm listening carefully, Nicholas. But first answer me. Where are the other members of your family? Your wife and daughter?" "Oh, I pray to Hortal that they are safe. The night before last, I sent them to my cousin, Tan Samalis. His castle is 5 days' journey west of here in the Valley of Blooming Heather. With them went 6 of my best guards and the faithful old Cohen. They left at dawn with strict orders to avoid villages and inns. Who knows how far this plague has spread? What is this plague, Nicholas? What is the nature of this curse, or whatever it is? Curse of Karaman. Where did it come from? How can it be fought?" Brent asked, unable to contain his frustration. "You're impatient. Youth! Youth!" The Tan's bloodless lips curled into that same bitter smile. "It's only right, speaking to a dying man, and my death is near. I haven't enough blood left in me to fill a dove." Brent gritted his teeth, helpless in the face of the inevitable. "The trouble," Nicholas continued, "is that I can't confidently answer any of your questions. I know as much as you do. Such cases have occurred before in this country, but they were rare. Werewolves were always dealt with before they could do significant harm. It was in the chronicles recalling those incidents that I first came across the idea that silver is deadly to them. But I digress, and time is short. This began about 2 moons ago. At first, everyone believed it was merely a recurrence of previous incidents, and that it would pass. Oh, how dearly we paid for our complacency. The number of werewolves grew steadily, like an avalanche in the mountains. 1 stone, then 2, then 4, 10. And soon they crashed down on us. Villages turned into werewolves en masse. And here's the worst part. The chronicles claim that werewolves transform only during the full moon. But in our lands, the transformations were happening every night. Each night, their numbers grew, and the number of humans dwindled. I tried to fight, but it was already too late. So I began sending messengers to find you. Brent, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't mere chance, but the work of some dark will, black sorcery. But where is its source? Things grew unbearable after that. All the villages around here became populated by werewolves. 3 days ago, a pair of monsters broke into my castle. We killed them, of course, but it was the beginning of the end. So I sent my wife and daughter to my cousin. Yes. Brent, find them, no matter the cost. No matter what happens. My soul will not rest until I know they are safe. Nicholas fell silent for a long time. When he opened his eyes again, Brent asked, "How is your wound? Can you speak?" "Worse than ever, but that's for the best," the Tan replied. "I'm dying, and my death will go unavenged. My son, my heir, has died before me." With a sharp movement, Brent pulled out his amulet containing the White Hawk's claw, pressed it to his lips, and quickly vowed, "I, Brent the Archer, swear by the great snowy sanctuary of the White Hermit that I will avenge your death, Tan Nicholas Sardan. Whoever your enemy may be, man or demon, I will not know peace or rest until I fulfill this oath or die." A calm smile touched the lips of the dying man. His face relaxed, and Tan Nicholas's spirit passed with his final breath into the land of lament and sorrow, at peace, knowing that such a vow could never be broken by any mortal, least of all by Brent the Archer. But Brent didn't mourn long over the fallen. Hatred for the unknown enemy and a thirst for vengeance spurred him into action. Soon, a funeral pyre burned in the castle courtyard, consuming in its roaring flames the bodies of Tan Nicholas, his son, and the warriors who had stayed true to their lord until their last breath. Thick, oily black smoke carried the scent of burning flesh over the mountains and valleys. Brent, having retrieved his bow and quiver from the saddle of his dead horse, slipped into a hidden, little-known room in the castle's basement. From there, a secret passageway began. Brent entered the basalt-carved tunnel with his sword drawn, though Arendir remained silent. No danger lay ahead. He lit a prepared torch and descended the steps, unaware that Obadon, having finally returned, was hoarsely calling for him at the castle wall. The underground passage ended in a small, inconspicuous ravine far from the castle, marked only by a black pillar of smoke rising over the mountain. From there, Brent continued onward, guided by little more than instinct and the resolve to find and destroy his enemy. Toward noon, he stopped by a stream, rested, drank cold water, and, sitting on the soft green grass beneath a fir tree, performed a search spell as well as he could in such conditions. He waited a few minutes for the results, and they came. The spell had worked. The source of the dark magic lay northeast, 2 or 3 days' journey on foot into the mountains. The knowledge settled in his mind effortlessly, as it always did with a successful search spell. After a brief hour and a half of restless sleep, Brent rose and set out to the northeast. Brent walked with his usual springy, quick stride, one that could cover dozens of miles in a day. Each step led him deeper into the Uriel Mountains, toward their steepest, most rugged divide, the Middle Ridge. Brent walked with his usual springy, quick stride, one that could cover dozens of miles in a day. Each step led him deeper into the Uriel Mountains toward their steepest, most rugged divide, the Middle Ridge. As the mountains rose around him, the air grew colder, the vegetation sparser. Small, twisted bushes clung to life among the rocky outcrops, and low-lying mist curled around the slopes, casting shadows in every crevice. The trail, scarcely visible, wound between boulders and through narrow ravines that were treacherous underfoot. Brent kept his senses sharpened, watching for any movement, aware of how isolated he was in this unforgiving terrain. In the silence of the mountains, even the smallest sound, a falling pebble, a sudden gust of wind, felt amplified and more menacing. Here the stone was jagged and sharp, torn by ages of harsh weather, and even the plants seemed unfriendly, with thorns and coarse, waxy leaves that resisted the cold. He navigated around a narrow fissure, peering down to see a sheer drop that seemed to vanish into darkness. The sun barely penetrated the dense mist that hung in the chasm, making it impossible to tell how deep it was. Stepping carefully, he moved along the ledge, but suddenly the ground beneath him shifted. A hidden patch of loose shale sent a cascade of small stones rattling down into the darkness. He steadied himself, gripping his bow tighter, and pressing his body close to the rock face until he felt secure. As he progressed, the path grew narrower, twisting upward toward a series of steep, rock-strewn slopes. At times, Brent had to use his hands, scrambling up, pressing his feet against the sharp rocks to keep from slipping. His fingers were raw from the cold. His legs ached with the relentless climb, and yet he pushed forward, determined. Every so often, he would pause, crouching to examine the trail for signs of predators or other travelers. He saw the prints of small mountain animals, hares, foxes, and once even the faint tracks of a bear. But there was something else, too. In a patch of soft soil, he found the deep, elongated paw print of a creature he couldn't identify. The impression was fresh, the claws sunk deep into the earth, and the width of the paw was wider than his own hand. It was a reminder that these mountains were not deserted, and that the usual laws of nature could mean little in a place steeped in dark magic. He moved onward, but the sight stayed with him. The day was wearing on, and as Brent climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling through the rocky crags, biting through his clothes. In one exposed area, he found himself nearly blown off balance, the wind pushing with a force that seemed unnatural. Pressing forward, he caught sight of movement up ahead, a shadow that darted between rocks too quickly for him to make out clearly. His heart rate quickened and he slowed his pace, lowering his stance, creeping forward with his bow ready. But by the time he reached the spot, it was empty, only the wind whistling through the rocks. The shadows seemed to gather as the light dimmed, merging into shapes that seemed to shift just out of the corner of his eye. He knew the mountains played tricks, but here the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Something was out there, and Brent was certain it was more than just wild animals. This land was tainted. He could feel it in the air, and it weighed heavily on him, a constant, prickling unease at the back of his mind. Brent continued onward, the oppressive silence of the Ural Mountains closing in around him. The path grew steeper, demanding more caution with every step. He kept his bow ready, his hand steady, his eyes darting between shadows. The wind had dropped to a low, constant murmur, yet the stillness brought an unsettling sense of anticipation, as though the mountains themselves held their breath. Eventually, he reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a small, hidden valley. The land below was blanketed in a dense layer of fog, and faint sounds echoed up from the mist, strange low growls that didn't belong to any creature he could name. Brent scanned the area, watching the shadows that seemed to shift in the fog. He knew he needed to cross this valley to reach the middle ridge, but something told him he would not be alone down there. Descending carefully, he approached the valley floor, where the ground was soft and damp. Every footstep left an impression in the earth, and Brent moved quietly, his instincts on high alert. The growls he had heard grew louder, more defined, and now he could make out separate sounds: breathing, the snap of twigs, the slithering of something heavy dragging through the mud. Ahead, the fog parted just enough for him to glimpse movement. Shapes slid through the mist, massive and hulking, their forms distorted by the thick air. Brent crouched low, watching, his heart pounding but his mind steady. He recognized the creatures now. Dire wolves, larger and far more aggressive than ordinary wolves, with muscular bodies and jaws capable of snapping bones. They roamed the misty valley in a silent hunt, their eyes catching occasional glimmers in the fading daylight. Brent held his position, waiting for an opening to slip past. Suddenly, one of the wolves lifted its head, sniffing the air, and its piercing eyes turned in his direction. With calculated precision, Brent reached for an arrow, aiming to avoid confrontation but prepared to defend himself if necessary. The dire wolf took a step forward, its massive paws sinking into the mud, testing the air around him. Then, without warning, the creature lunged forward, crashing through the mist with a low, snarling growl. Brent loosed an arrow, and the shaft struck true, hitting the wolf in its flank and forcing it to stumble. Without hesitating, Brent bolted across the valley, keeping his eyes on the shadowed forms still prowling in the fog. He could hear the injured wolf howling behind him, and the other creatures responded with chilling answering calls. The valley seemed endless as he raced through the fog, dodging fallen branches and leaping over small streams. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, the wolves relentless. Brent glanced back to see two more dark shapes closing in, their breaths steaming in the cold air. He drew another arrow, spinning mid-stride to release it, striking one of the wolves in the shoulder. It fell back, snapping at the arrow shaft while the other continued the chase. Brent sprinted toward a dense cluster of trees, hoping the cover would buy him time. The trees here were thick and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss, creating a maze of twisted roots and low-hanging limbs. He ducked and wove through the shadows, hearing the wolf snarl as it followed. The creature's claws scraped against the ground, tearing at roots and soil in its determination to close the gap. Finally, Brent spotted an overhanging rock, a natural shelter partially concealed by the thick branches above. Without a second thought, he climbed onto the ledge, pressing himself against the stone. The dire wolf skidded to a halt below, sniffing the air, searching for him. For a long, tense moment, it circled the area, its eyes glowing in the dim light, its teeth bared as it snarled in frustration. Then, with one final look around, it turned back toward the valley, disappearing into the fog with an echoing growl. Brent exhaled, the tension draining from his body. He remained on the ledge for a few moments, listening for any other signs of movement. Satisfied that the danger had passed, he continued his journey, pushing further into the mountains. The memory of the dire wolves lingered in his mind, a reminder of the threats that roamed these lands. With night approaching, he quickened his pace, determined to find a safe place to rest before the shadows grew too thick around him. Before sunset, he brought down a yearling deer with a single well-placed arrow. With utmost caution, he built a small fire, ate a quick meal, rested half an hour, then continued on, taking the hind leg of the deer with him. As night fell, he climbed a tall pine with a sturdy trunk and spent the night tied securely to the tree, about 20 feet up. Accustomed to light sleep, Brent awoke several times, glimpsing dark shadows moving below, yellow eyes watching him, and on occasion, a distant howl. He didn't know if they were werewolves, simple wolves, or other creatures. At dawn, after a quick bite, he continued his journey. The way became harder and harder, forcing him to scramble up rocky ledges and navigate around narrow ravines and fissures that slowed his progress. Brent had almost scaled another ledge, carpeted with emerald green grass, when he suddenly heard a low, warning growl just steps away. He looked up. A massive snow-white beast crouched in the middle of the quiet glade, thick muscles bunched beneath its dense, long fur, and sharp fangs glinted in a threatening snarl. Around its neck, Brent noticed a spiked collar made of white metal. He was in a precarious position. He was halfway up, waist-high above the ledge, with loose stones underfoot that prevented him from getting a firm hold or drawing his weapon. He froze, meeting the animal's honey-gold eyes. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as time stretched painfully. The creature didn't attack. Thoughts raced through Brent's mind, but he couldn't see a way out. The only advantage was that, other than growling, the powerful beast showed no signs of aggression. Suddenly, the oppressive silence was broken by a quiet voice coming from behind a nearby rock. "What have you found there, Amok? Come here." The beast sprang up, wagging its tail, and trotted over to its master, though it continued to cast a watchful eye in Brent's direction. "Lie down, Amok." With a sigh of relief, Brent finally hauled himself up onto the ledge and looked at the stranger. It was a short, stocky old man, wrapped in a dark green cloak that reached to his heels. His hood, thrown back, revealed a deeply wrinkled, sun-darkened face, framed by a white beard and mustache, and a bald head with a faint white fuzz. There was no threat in the old man's eyes, only gentle strength, endless kindness, and weariness. In his right hand he held a long staff topped with a forked end, and slung over his left arm was the handle of a basket filled with herbs and roots. "Blessings be upon your path, stranger," the old man said. "What brings you to this cursed land?" "May your days be long, teacher," Brent replied respectfully, addressing the owner of the beast in the traditional manner of the druidic order, to which this man clearly belonged. "I'm here on personal business, and I'm not sure it's wise to share even with you. I see the mark of concern and a shadow of hatred on your face, but there is no trace of evil within you. Your aura is pure and noble." The old man smiled gently. "I am Alcurton," he said, his voice ringing like a silver bell. "Once, I studied the arts of magic among the brother druids, but now I lead a hermit's life. Share your story with me. We may have a common enemy. I am Brent, known as the Archer." "What guides you in life, Brent the Archer?" "I don't know, teacher. Life tosses me like the wind does a dry leaf. Different feelings pull me in different directions. But right now, I am driven by vengeance." "For what? And against whom do you seek revenge?" "I seek revenge for the deaths of Tan Nicholas and his son, but I don't yet know whom I'm avenging them against. I only have a sense of where they are." "So the Tan has passed," Alcurton said thoughtfully. "Not just passed. He was killed. By werewolves. Quiet. Don't speak of such things in their lair." "Their lair?" "The time for explanations will come, Brent the Archer. I mourn the Tan. He was a worthy master of his land. Not a lazy lord, but a wise father. You are traveling to the northeast?" "Yes, by the sanctuary of the White Hermit. I swear it." The druid paused, as if pondering a complex question known only to him, then quietly said, "We're headed in the same direction, Brent the Archer. Follow me." They moved along a barely visible path winding between boulders and rock outcrops. Alcurton led the way with light steps, barely seeming to lean on his staff. Brent followed, with Amok bringing up the rear, still casting suspicious glances at the newcomer. The path led them to the entrance of a cave, sealed by 2 massive doors reinforced with metal plates, the same metal as the spikes on the dog's collar. Silver, Brent guessed. They entered the cave. In the center, a fire pit of irregular stones smoldered faintly, sending a thin trail of blue smoke into a crack in the ceiling. Alcertan tapped his staff on the floor, and soft, milky white globes of light sprang to life along the walls. "Sit, Brent," the wizard said, gesturing toward a low stone bed covered in animal skins. "Forgive me, I rarely have guests. In fact, until now, I've had none, so there's no need for guest chairs." Thanking him, Brent sat and looked around with interest. The cave looked more like a healer's dwelling than a wizard's lair. There were no spell books or talismans, only bundles of dried herbs along the wall. A pot, a couple of bowls, a cup, and a jug on a flat stone near the hearth. Alcertan seemed to sense his thoughts and smiled softly. "No, you won't find dried frogs or bat wings here. I study the druidic arts. Herbs and plants are the core of our craft. But now, listen." The wizard sat down on his bed beside Brent with the enormous dog settling at his feet. "All the evil of this land is concentrated and rooted in a single man. A man by birth, but a fiend by spirit. He is a dark mage and sorcerer, Yarenbir Belojlik. Strange name for these parts, isn't it? That's because he isn't a native. He appeared about 1.5 years ago. I managed to find out he came from a distant land in the southeast, where he lost a power struggle to an even crueler and mightier rival. Arriving here, he spent a long time licking his wounds and, in the process, built himself a palace on a cliff. That very palace to the northeast is now his stronghold. Once he regained his strength, Yarenbir began scheming to conquer. Nicholas's lands were to become his foothold for an assault on the entire Western world. Indeed, that was his ambition, nothing less. Having accepted defeat in the east, Yarenbir set his sights on the west. But he made a mistake. The first of the Western wizards he encountered was me, and I have never been considered particularly promising in the magical arts. Until now, my duties had been little more than solving minor household problems for local farmers, and for the past year, even that had faded away. But still, I managed, through ancient spells and enchantments, to recall long-forgotten incantations and halt his ambitions. However, a month ago, his power suddenly grew several-fold. I found myself unable to contend with his black magic and sought refuge in this cave. And to keep his servants from disturbing me, creatures he intends to turn the entire Western world into, by the way, I reinforced the doors with silver. But I fear Yarenbir will soon teach the werewolves not to fear silver. And then... Alcertan leapt to his feet, his young malachite green eyes flashing with fervor. "This is our last chance, Brent the Archer. I don't know what caused the surge in his power, but if it continues, he'll become nearly omnipotent. And then I don't know which of the living magicians would be able to stand against him. Only the White Hermit, but he hasn't interfered in human affairs directly for a long time." "I have the talisman of the White Hermit," Brent said, pulling the amulet with the white hawk's claw from beneath his chainmail. Alcertan looked at it with respect. "Then we mustn't sit idle. Evil is stretching its tentacles across the world like a foul kraken, and it is our task to cut them off. Where a wizard and a hero are powerless alone, their alliance can achieve victory. Not chance, but fate has brought us together. Your hand, Brent the Archer." The two allies sealed their pact with a handshake. Brent then sat back down, and the mage continued to pace excitedly around the cave. "How well protected is Yarenbir's stronghold?" Brent asked. "Not in any conventional sense. It's not a castle or a fortress, but it is fortified with dark spells and guarded by his fearsome servants, the werewolves. But werewolves only come out at night. Unfortunately, not anymore. A few of them can now roam during the day. These are the most fearsome and savage creatures. The personal guard of Beloch Lick. Perhaps because of this, or for some other reason, he keeps them close to his palace. But like the others, they still fear silver. Yes, for now at least they do, and we can't waste that chance. Look what I have. Alcertan pulled a heavy basket from the dimly lit corner of the cave, throwing back the cloth that covered it. Intrigued, Brent leaned over to see that it was filled with silver items. Arrowheads, spear tips, 2 or 3 daggers, studs, and spikes to reinforce armor. "Excellent," Brent exclaimed, pleased. "It's exactly what I need. I'll have time before evening to replace the tips on all my arrows, and then we'll see just how strong Yarenbir's guards really are. Equip yourself with weapons for close combat as well," the mage advised. "Unfortunately, there's nothing here that can replace Arendir. A dagger is no substitute for a sword, and there's no shaft for a spear." "Arendir, you say?" Alcertan raised an eyebrow. "The legendary blade of the Elven Prince?" Instead of answering, Brent drew the sword from its scabbard and offered it to the wizard hilt first. Alcertan took it reverently, running his thin fingers along the blade. "Yes, this is elven craftsmanship. Runes with incantations are embedded in its metal. I can feel them. It's a remarkable weapon, merciless to enemies and gentle to friends, but it cannot kill a werewolf. No, it can't. I've already tried. But unlike ordinary steel, Arendir can still injure them, at least enough to cut them. And it only grants a temporary reprieve," Alcertan continued, "since the severed halves of a werewolf, if they find each other, will simply reattach. But even the chance to delay them is something." "Agreed, but take a silver dagger. With it, you'll be able to finish off enemies, completing the work Arendir begins." Finding no argument against this logic, Brent selected a dagger forged from pure silver to replace the one he had left behind at the inn. "Now let's get to our tasks," Alcertan said, returning Brent's sword. "You prepare your arrows, and I'll prepare myself for battle with Yarenbir in my own way, through magic. Meanwhile, tell me everything you've seen and experienced in these lands since we first met." Replacing arrowheads was so familiar to Brent that he did it almost instinctively, focusing more on recounting his experiences from the moment his horse stopped at the ill-fated inn to the point where he had sworn to avenge his still unknown enemy and closed the eyes of Taun Nicholas. As Brent spoke, Alcertan continued his own work without missing a beat. He carefully selected specific herbs, roots, and flowers from various bundles, grinding and mixing them in a stone mortar, measuring proportions, burning them and washing his face in the fragrant smoke, whispering incantations, or placing some of them into pouches which he then tied to his belt. Their peaceful work was interrupted by a howl right outside the door. Brent looked at the wizard in surprise, but Alcertan remained focused on his preparations. Noticing Brent's alert expression, Alcertan smiled. "I've grown used to it. Amok too. Night must have fallen. Yarenbir sends his creatures every night. I'm not sure what he expects. He can't defeat me here, just as I can't take him down in his lair. Not alone, anyway. The silver-studded door wards them off, so pay it no mind. Let them howl themselves hoarse." The mage fell silent for a moment, then resumed speaking. "You've seen Yarenbir with your own eyes." "Where? You even shot an arrow at him." "So that creature on the road?" "Precisely. Yarenbir Beloch Lick himself." but he doesn't look human. In time, a soul's ugliness seeps to the surface, although I hear he was never a beauty to begin with. There's a rumor that one of his ancestors mingled with a hyena, though I wouldn't put too much stock in gossip. His mind is fully human, however. By the way, would you like to know your friend's fate? Of course. And perhaps even send him a message if he's safe. That would be wonderful. Obadan promised to return, but... Alcurton retrieved a small brazier, filling it with hot coals. This Sultan of Zbedosh, can he be relied upon? Can we count on his help? Absolutely. I trust him as I trust myself. His help could be invaluable. Good. Write down whatever you wish to say and prepare an arrow. The wizard handed Brent a piece of birch bark, then sprinkled a pinch of powdered roots and bark onto the coals. As a purple smoke rose in a round cloud, he silently moved his lips, forming signs with his fingers. Now that everything is prepared, sit and focus your will on your friend, watching the smoke. Following Alcurton's instructions, Brent focused his gaze on the shifting cloud of smoke, channeling his thoughts toward Obadan. The mage stood beside him, and Brent felt the wizard's will merging with his own, guiding it. Suddenly, Brent saw Obadan so clearly it was as if he could reach out and touch him. The Sultan was seated in a tree, gripping a sturdy branch between his legs like a horse and leaning his back against the trunk. His eyes were peacefully closed. Obadan was asleep. "Pierce your message with an arrow and shoot it into the tree," Alcurton whispered. Brent obeyed. The arrow flew through the cloud without resistance, becoming ghostly, like the vision itself, as it embedded in the tree trunk mere inches from Obadan's head. Obadan immediately woke up. He pulled the arrow from the wood and read the message by moonlight. A comically puzzled expression crossed his face, and he began looking around so frantically that Brent couldn't hold back a loud laugh. The smoke swirled and dissipated, and the vision faded. "Well done," Alcurton said. "Let's hope your friend is close enough to our target and reaches it by noon tomorrow. That's when we must strike Yaranbir. Noon is the most favorable time for us and the least advantageous for him. For now, you need to rest before the decisive battle." Brent didn't argue. He stretched out on the skins and fell asleep almost immediately. When he awoke, the wizard was still deep in his preparations, working with herbs and aromatic smoke. "It's already dawn," Alcurton said, his voice steady and unfazed, betraying no sign of a sleepless night before a battle that could very well be his last. "Eat something and let's be off." Brent quickly ate some nuts and honey from wild bees, then took up his weapons and followed the wizard to the cave's exit. The sun had risen high, illuminating the mountain slopes but leaving dark patches in the ravines, crevices, and under rock ledges. Ahead of them ran the loyal dog, scouting for any potential danger under his master's command. Alcurton, having pulled his green hood over his bald head against the chill morning air, walked next, with Brent bringing up the rear, one hand on his quiver and the other resting on his sword. For a long time, nothing but rocks hindered their progress. Finally, the wizard stopped and, with the end of his staff, pointed out a large, misshapen structure of black stone clinging to the side of a towering cliff like a swallow's nest. It was their destination, the palace of Yaranbir Balod's-Lik. A single path led to it. "We're entering the beast's lair. Be ready," Alcurton said, lowering his hood. Now his entire being was focused and alert. They walked along a narrow path no more than 9 feet wide, winding between a chaotic mass of rocks and sparse, twisted pines and birches that clung to life among the stones. No visible threat appeared. Only once did Alcertan signal his companions to hug the cliff wall, then threw a medium-sized rock to reveal a hidden pitfall as it collapsed, exposing a deep chasm. Suddenly, Amok, who was leading, startled a flock of black crows. Before they could take flight, the wizard waved his cloak, and most of the birds dropped back onto the path, lulled to sleep by his magical incense. One escaped, however, cawing loudly as it flew toward the palace. "Not good," the wizard muttered under his breath. "Now we've lost the element of surprise. He'll take measures to prepare a welcome." The small group pressed on with double caution and triple speed, hoping to gain some ground. But it was futile. Yaranbir Balochlik had been alerted to their approach. They hadn't gone 1,000 steps when a fierce roar and the thunder of many feet sounded around the bend ahead. The wizard and his dog stopped, Amok's hackles raised, ready for battle. "Now, show me what you can do, Brent the archer," Alcertan whispered. Brent dropped to one knee, readied his bow, and placed a half-dozen arrows on the ground in front of him. The first werewolf to round the bend was dead before Brent could even see it properly. As he loosed his next arrow, he noted that 7 of the creatures remained, much larger and uglier than any he had faced before. Only 5 of them made it close. Amok tackled one to the ground, while a bolt of lightning from the mage's staff struck down another. Unsheathing Arendir in his right hand and wielding the silver dagger in his left, Brent leapt forward. One swipe of his sword to the right, a thrust of his dagger to the left, and one werewolf continued running down the path, though without its head, while another collapsed in spasms, a silver blade driven into its heart. He had just enough time to block the last werewolf's lunge with his sword as it barreled into him, but the beast didn't slow down. Brent was thrown onto his back, the werewolf's fanged jaws close, and he stabbed wildly with the dagger. At that moment, a golden lightning bolt struck between the creature's eyes, sent by Alcertan, and Amok leapt in, knocking the lifeless body off Brent's chest and tearing at it for good measure. 8 beasts, the mage murmured, concerned. "I didn't think we'd escape so easily. It's no wonder they call you the archer, Brent." "What now?" Brent asked, getting to his feet. "Forward. The faster, the better. We haven't seen all the surprises yet." They dashed up the path at full speed. Another turn, then another, and finally, the towering palace of Yaranbir appeared before them. But any sense of relief was short-lived. Blocking the entrance was the most nightmarish creature they had seen. Yaranbir's prized guard, a monstrous werewolf nearly twice the size of an ordinary bear. The companions froze in their tracks. The beast advanced with a guttural growl, yellow drool dripping from its jaws. Brent's arrows whistled through the air, piercing its hide, but they failed to reach any vital organs. Only one arrow, lodging in its eye, forced the werewolf to stagger, spinning in place. Tense as a drawn bowstring, Alcertan unleashed a barrage of lightning bolts at the creature's face. The beast rose onto its hind legs, opening its enormous maw in a terrifying roar. "Blind it!" the wizard gasped, emptying the contents of a pouch into his hand. "Go, Amok! Take it down!" The ensuing events were a blur of motion. Brent's arrow struck the werewolf's other eye. Amok clamped his jaws on its throat, and a fireball from Alcertan's hand struck the beast's forehead. The scent of singed fur filled the air. With a deep guttural bellow, the monster took a few faltering steps backward and tumbled over the edge of the cliff, dragging loyal Amok with it into the seemingly bottomless abyss. "Forward!" shouted the mage. "We have no time." They rushed into the palace. Brent was an excellent runner, but the old wizard stayed ahead of him the entire time, a golden light radiating from his staff, scattering the shadows lurking in the palace's dark corridors. Focused on their charge, they suddenly found themselves in a spacious hall with a high, vaulted ceiling, flooded with sunlight pouring through narrow windows. Heavy bronze bowls hung from the ceiling on thick chains, likely used to light the hall at night or burn some dark incense, or perhaps both. In the center of the room, a bright flame burned atop a basalt pedestal. Behind the fire stood a stone table, upon which lay a book with darkened, time-worn parchment pages and an ornate binding. Standing there was the very figure Brent and Obadon had encountered on the mountain road that night. His thin lips curled back to reveal long, rotting teeth as Yaranbir Belodj Leek laughed heartily, if he could be said to have a soul. Brent stopped and pulled his bowstring back to his ear. But the dark mage merely tilted slightly to one side, made a sliding gesture with his left hand and caught the arrow mid-flight. He blew on it, scattering ashes from his palm, and laughed again. Alkertan formed a magical sign with his left hand, then sprinkled some of his concoction into his palm. He blew, and a ball of fire shot from his hand toward Yaranbir's heart. The sorcerer pressed his palms together in front of his chest, halting the fireball and forcing it back. But Alkertan's will and spells drove the fireball forward. Now Yaranbir's expression was no longer jovial. His lips tightened, his brows furrowed, and veins bulged at his temples. Sensing the opportunity, Brent reached for another arrow, only to find his quiver empty. At that moment the fireball burst with a deafening crack, unable to withstand the pressure from both sides. Large drops of sweat appeared on the faces of both wizards. Without missing a beat, a now less composed Belodj Leek grabbed 2 handfuls of something resembling dried frog legs and tossed it into the fire. Flames shot up 10 feet high, and thick green smoke began to crawl across the floor, first rising to knee height, then to the waist. Attempting to step forward, Brent found himself unable to move. The smoke wrapped around him, binding him in place. Yaranbir spoke again, this time with a grim and severe tone. "You are much stronger than I thought," he said, his voice like the bark of a hyena. "Well, let this serve as a lesson. I was too kind and careless. I didn't use all the powers of the Book of Spirits when I finally acquired it, but now I'll rectify that mistake. With my army of werewolves, I'll pierce this land like a red-hot needle, reach the Skagar Bay, and from there, conquer the great Western Ocean. I will take over the entire world." "You won't dare," Alkertan said, his voice strained, as the smoke reached his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Oh, I'll dare, with my mind and the power of the Book of Spirits." Yaranbir sneered. "No one will stop me. I'll catch them all off guard, and by the time the white wizards and clueless rulers know, it will be too late. Only you." Yaranbir grinned wickedly. "Only you two tried to stand in my way, but you failed? Poor fools. Soon this smoke will cover your heads, and that will be the end of the self-taught archer and the village healer. You'll die in agony. A parting pleasure for me. Curse you," the white mage rasped. His short stature left his head nearly enveloped by the smoke. With a tremendous effort, Brent raised his hand to his chest, feeling the talisman of the white hermit under his chainmail. The touch invigorated him, and he forced his legs forward, straining muscles that resisted obeying him. The sorcerer noticed Brent's movement and reached for another dose of the potion. At that moment, something flashed through the air, and a figure in chainmail made of white metal landed on the table before a stunned Yaranbir. Mid-leap, He kicked the dark mage and knocked the Book of Spirits into the fire with his other foot. The flames hissed and eagerly consumed the parchment pages. With a furious scream, Yarenbeer slithered across the stone floor, desperately trying to save the book, but a flash of a curved Kyphian saber stopped him in his tracks, frozen in an unnatural pose. "Obadon," Brent shouted, "stop the smoke!" The Sultan of Zbedosh, for it was indeed him, rushed to the fire and began kicking the burning coals with his high boots. In seconds, the Book of Spirits was reduced to a handful of pale ash. The paralyzing smoke, no longer sustained, gradually weakened and began to dissipate. Al-Kertan, nearly choking, would have collapsed if Brent hadn't caught him. "We did it, teacher." "Where is he?" the wizard asked with bloodless lips. "There." Brent and Obadon pointed to the empty spot where the dark mage had lain just moments before. Yarenbeer, crouching and clutching his nearly severed right arm, was fleeing across the hall toward a heavy curtain covering an exit. Obadon and Brent sprang after him like tigers, but even their speed might not have been enough had a golden lightning bolt not flashed between them, striking the sorcerer in the knees. He stumbled backward, tried to rise, but froze in terror as he saw two blades raised above his head. Quick though Obadon was, Brent, driven by deadly hatred, was faster. Arendir swept in a wide arc and fell upon the villain's neck. The half-human, half-beast head rolled across the floor, baring its fangs and leaving a trail of black blood. The friends exchanged glances. Yarenbeer Belot's Leek's final scream still echoed in their ears. "Victory," Obadon said. "Victory." "Now Nicholas can rest in peace," Brent replied. "Victory, yes. But there's still a bit left to secure it," remarked Al-Kertan with a thoughtful nod as he approached. "Tell us what to do, teacher." "We'll see it through," Brent said with a smile. Soon, Yarenbeer Beloj Lik's body was burned, and his ashes scattered to the wind. The three comrades left the Black Palace, and after they had walked a fair distance away, Al-Kertan began tracing intricate signs with his fingers, chanting an incantation in ancient Roshanese. Rocking rhythmically with the flowing words, he sprinkled the last of his potion into the air. The powder floated, forming a perfect sphere, and with a few deliberate gestures he directed it toward the palace. As it approached the dark stronghold, the sphere grew larger and soon encompassed it entirely. Then the wizard tapped his staff forward, sending a yellow glow from its tip into the sphere, which burst into an intense, blinding light before vanishing instantly. The palace disappeared along with it. Al-Kertan turned to face Brent and Obadon. In the past hour, he seemed to have aged a decade. "My friends, we have won a great victory. We have brought down one of the most ambitious and dangerous dark sorcerers of our time. Sadly, the Book of Spirits cannot be destroyed so easily. The nature of the spells that created it is such that once burned here, it reappears somewhere else in the cosmos. How I wish it would manifest in some distant realm. But the important thing is, we have freed countless people from the cursed spell that plagued the nearby villages and settlements. Now we'll each go our separate ways. But before we do, I'd like to know how the Sultan of Zbedosh arrived just in time," he said, looking at Obadon. "After receiving your message," Obadon replied with a smirk. "I tracked your path all the way here. The werewolves on the road hadn't even cooled. I was afraid I'd miss the final battle, but when I heard Yarenbeer's laughter echoing from the hall, I decided it was wiser to sneak in. I scaled the wall and watched everything unfold. As for the rest, you know it well. Those lamps on chains seemed practically made for swinging across rooms. All I needed was a good push with both feet." A truly life-saving push, I swear by Muscalat's own dropsy, Brent laughed. I was already saying my goodbyes. As was I, added Alcartan. After a short pause, he continued, And where do you plan to go now that all this has happened? I think I'll make another attempt to reclaim my throne, Obadan replied. I'm getting older, weaker, time to settle down in honor and comfort. And I promised Tan Nicholas that I'd find his wife and daughter, Brent said. Then if you're willing to wait, I'll gladly help you pay Muscalat a visit with my blade. Good. May your gods bless you both, Alcartan said, offering them a protective druidic gesture. With this dagger, Brent the archer, you'll be able to buy a pair of horses at the nearest village. No, I'll keep it as a memory of you, teacher, Brent replied solemnly. I'll trade for horses with a few of these gold coins, he said, jingling the pouch at his belt. Farewell, teacher. Brent bowed, and Obadan, following southern custom, placed both hands over his heart. Soon after, Brent and Obadan were descending the path away from the site of their recent battle, while the hermit, watching them go, began piling stones where his loyal companion Amok had fallen. 5 days later, the two travelers rode humble farm horses southward along the northeast road. Gray cloaks covered the torn clothes of one and the glistening chainmail of the other. On the head of the chainmail-clad rider was a turban with a peacock feather, while his companion's hair was tied back with a leather strap. As they rounded a bend, they spotted an inn whose appearance struck them as oddly familiar. The innkeeper, drying his hands on his apron, ran from the porch to the gate, loudly calling to his guests. At his feet darted a small dog with reddish fur and white markings. As the travelers looked at his simple, flushed face and tousled hair, a vision flashed in their minds of a snarling maw, its teeth dripping with human blood. The rider in the white turban reached for his curved saber, but his companion gently stayed his hand. Leave it, Obadan. He didn't know what he was doing. It's all over now. Yes, you're right, Archer. Just a fleeting shadow. From here, our paths diverge. The Valley of Blooming Heather lies west of here, while Zbadosh is far to the south. Then goodbye, Archer. Until we meet again. Until we meet again, Obadan. We'll see each other again when we're needed. Not wishing to prolong the farewell, they spurred their horses and soon disappeared from sight, leaving the puzzled innkeeper behind. As Brent rode away from the crossroads where he had parted with Obadan, the landscape began to change subtly. The rugged mountains gave way to rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and ancient oaks. The air grew warmer, and the scent of pine was replaced by that of blooming heather and distant sea breezes. Brent's thoughts turned to Tan Nicholas's wife and daughter, hidden somewhere in the Valley of Blooming Heather. The promise he had made weighed heavily on his mind, but it also gave him purpose. The journey was long, and Brent traveled mostly in silence, his senses attuned to the world around him. He avoided well-trodden paths, preferring the solitude of lesser-known trails where dangers were fewer, and the chance of encountering remnants of Yarenbir's dark influence was minimal. The countryside seemed peaceful, but Brent knew that shadows often lurked beneath tranquil surfaces. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Brent found himself at the edge of an ancient forest. The trees here were tall and majestic, their canopies forming a tapestry of greens and golds. Entering the forest, he felt a shift in the air, a kind of timelessness that both calmed and unsettled him. Legend spoke of this woodland as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where travelers might stumble upon remnants of old magic. As night fell, Brent made camp beneath a massive oak whose roots formed natural walls around a small clearing. He lit a modest fire, its glow casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Sleep came lightly, filled with fragmented dreams of battles past and unknown futures. In the morning, the forest was cloaked in a gentle mist. Brent resumed his journey, navigating by instinct more than sight. The forest seemed to guide him, the path unfolding naturally before his horse's steady gait. By midday, the mist lifted, revealing a glade bathed in sunlight. At its center stood a stone archway covered in vines and inscribed with runes that Brent recognized from his time with Al-Qurtan. Approaching the archway, Brent felt a subtle energy emanating from it, a protective barrier perhaps, or a gateway. Trusting in the guidance of the white hermit and the talisman he still wore, he passed through the arch. On the other side, the forest thinned, and the valley of blooming heather stretched out before him, a vast expanse of purple and pink blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. Descending into the valley, Brent was struck by its serene beauty. The heather seemed to ripple like the surface of a tranquil sea, and the distant sound of a stream added a musical quality to the air. Yet amidst the beauty, Brent remained vigilant. He knew that even the most idyllic places could harbor unseen dangers. As he journeyed deeper into the valley, signs of habitation began to appear. A well-worn footpath, a stone wall overgrown with moss, and finally, a modest cottage nestled among the heather. Smoke rose gently from its chimney, and the sound of laughter, light and free, floated on the wind. Brent dismounted and approached cautiously, his heart heavy with the weight of the news he carried. Upon reaching the cottage, he found it surrounded by a garden teeming with life. Herbs, flowers, and vegetables grew in harmonious abundance. Though he saw no one, the sense of welcome was palpable. Remembering his promise to avoid dialogue, Brent stood silently for a moment, then placed a token of Tan Nicholas, a signet ring he had carried, on the stone steps leading to the door. He retreated to a respectful distance and waited. After some time, the cottage door opened and a woman stepped out. Her features bore the grace and strength that Nicholas had often spoken of, and beside her stood a young girl, eyes wide with curiosity. They saw the ring and understood. Though words were unnecessary, a shared moment of grief and recognition passed between them and Brent, binding them in silent acknowledgement of loss and duty fulfilled. With his promise to Tan Nicholas honored, Brent felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering restlessness. He departed the valley, leaving its inhabitants to their peace. His path now led him toward the western shores, where rumors spoke of new troubles brewing, a shadow rising that threatened the fragile balance restored by Yarenbir's defeat. The journey westward took Brent through varied landscapes, over windswept moors, along riverbanks lined with willows, and through villages where whispers of strange occurrences unsettled the populace. Crops withered overnight, and livestock vanished without a trace. The signs were subtle but consistent, hinting at a malevolent force gaining strength. Brent's travels eventually brought him to the outskirts of an ancient city once known for its grandeur, but now shrouded in decay. The city's gates stood ajar, and vines crept over crumbling walls. Entering cautiously, Brent found the streets deserted, the silence oppressive. Statues of forgotten heroes stood watch over empty squares, their stone gazes conveying a sense of sorrow. Exploring further, Brent discovered that the city's inhabitants had retreated underground, seeking refuge from a blight that poisoned the very air. In the depths below, a makeshift community struggled to survive, their resources dwindling and hope fading. Though he adhered to his resolve of silence, Brent's presence was met with a mixture of suspicion and desperate optimism. He learned through observation and the fragmented stories shared among the people that a relic of great power lay hidden within the city. A relic that, if found, could either save them or doom them further. Determined to prevent another Yaranbir from rising, Brent set out to locate the relic before it could fall into the wrong hands. Navigating the labyrinthine corridors beneath the city, Brent relied on his instincts and the subtle guidance of the White Hermit's talisman. He bypassed traps and deciphered ancient inscriptions, each step bringing him closer to the heart of the city's forgotten legacy. The air grew colder, and an otherworldly glow began to emanate from ahead. Finally, he entered a vast chamber where the relic rested upon a pedestal of obsidian, a crystalline orb pulsing with an inner light. Brent approached cautiously, aware that such objects often carried hidden dangers. Recalling Al Curtin's teachings, he considered how best to secure the relic without unleashing its potential harm. Using a cloth imbued with protective herbs, Brent carefully wrapped the orb, its light dimming as he did so. The chamber trembled, and distant echoes suggested that his actions had triggered ancient defenses. With time running short, he retraced his steps, the sounds of the city's shifting foundations urging him onward. Emerging into the daylight, Brent knew that the relic could not remain in the city. It required safekeeping beyond the reach of those who might misuse it. He decided to seek out the White Hermit himself, a figure of legend who, despite his reclusiveness, remained a beacon of wisdom and balance. Setting his course northward, Brent felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, and challenges undoubtedly awaited. But he carried with him the experience of past trials and the quiet confidence born of overcoming them. The wind at his back and the open road before him, Brent the Archer journeyed on, a solitary figure bound by duty yet free in spirit, ever vigilant against the encroaching shadows.
Story 2.
Basil raced through the darkness of Norvind, clutching his blood-soaked coat sleeve with his left hand. In his pocket, a bottle of medical alcohol and a roll of bandages jostled together. But he had no intention of stopping to treat the wound here and now. His mind was fixated on a single thought like a beacon. Get out. Out of this forest. Back to the city. To people. The unbearable stench of torn-apart bodies still lingered in his nostrils. Even with his flashlight, Basil could barely make out the trail, stumbling more than once over roots, and nearly losing his only source of light. Without it, he'd be trapped in this cursed place until morning, immobilized by darkness, cold, and sheer terror. Although, terror already gripped him from head to toe. When he finally emerged at the outskirts of town, spotting the first few houses, he nearly broke into tears. All that was left now was to drag himself to the hospital building where he was temporarily living. Upon reaching it, Basil pushed the door open and collapsed inside, as if he'd been thrown like a sack of potatoes. He stumbled into the doctor's lounge, immediately peeling off his coat and tossing it into a corner, followed by his blood-soaked shirt. His forearm bore the crimson imprint of a beast's bite, a row of bloody punctures stretching from his wrist to the crook of his elbow. Thankfully, the veins had been spared. Basil fished the alcohol and bandages from his coat pocket, cleaned the wound, administered a rabies shot just in case, and then wrapped the injury. He pulled on a clean shirt, burned the bloodied clothes in the backyard, and returned inside. Opening a bottle of vodka, a gift from Lieutenant Karazin, damn him, he took a deep swig. Only when the alcohol began to warm his insides did he collapse onto the couch to process everything that had just happened. Since arriving in Nakhtumirsk, people had warned him about a fearsome werewolf that terrorized the townsfolk, but he had dismissed it as local folklore. Now, though, he'd encountered the creature himself, an enormous anthropomorphic beast covered in black fur, standing over 7 feet tall, with arms as thick as tree trunks. No wonder the commissioner had sent 3 soldiers to hunt it down. But the beast had torn them apart with such ease that it might as well have been shredding rag dolls. And Basil? The thing had only bitten his arm. Yes, now he was sure it had merely bitten him, because it could have easily torn it clean off and vanished back into the dark forest. If the legends were true about the werewolf's existence, then the rest of the story was likely true too. Anyone bitten by the creature would turn into a beast themselves by the next night. Basil glanced at the clock. 5 a.m. winter meant early darkness. He had about 12 hours. He let out a desperate cry, clutching the silver locket that hung around his neck. Opening it, he gazed at the portrait of a beautiful young woman inside. Then he sprang to his feet, rushed to the desk, grabbed a sheet of paper, and dipped his pen into the inkwell. For a moment he hesitated. Dearest Vicinia. No, too familiar. Basil crumpled the page and tossed it aside, grabbing another. Dear Vicinia, I write to you now to finally confess my feelings. It was no coincidence that I requested a post in Nakhtumirsk, though I could have easily stayed in the capital. The truth is... He didn't finish. The door creaked open and in walked Dr. Ringo Daimirov, his new supervisor. Seeing Basil, Daimirov stopped in the doorway, staring at him in astonishment. Oh, Basil, you're back. Good morning. Daimirov was already old, the fine lines of wrinkles accentuating his almond-shaped eyes. Perhaps that was why he had requested an assistant. His retirement was overdue. Daimirov moved toward the coat rack, starting to undress. Did you catch the werewolf? Basil tucked his bandaged arm deeper into his sleeve, hiding it. Who knew how people would react if they found out the creature had bitten him? Daimirov was a rational man who didn't believe in myths. But he was an Uln, and the local folklore was practically ingrained in their culture. It caught us, Basil replied. What happened? Basil recounted how the werewolf had ambushed them, ripped the 3 soldiers to pieces, and vanished. He didn't mention the bite, claiming instead that he'd panicked and fled, which was why he'd survived. Daimirov immediately stepped closer and placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. I understand. Any sensible person would have done the same. You've been through a lot, Daimirov said, nodding toward the vodka on the table. He fetched 2 aluminum cups from the cabinet, pouring a small measure for each of them. They clinked their cups together and drank. Doctor, tell me about this mythical creature, Basil asked. Where did it come from? I've only heard that it roams Norvend, nothing more. The Ulni believe a werewolf is a man who transforms into a wolf at night. They serve Tendris, the local moon god. And how does someone become such a creature? They say Tendris marks his servants in some way, but what that mark is, no one knows except for them. A bite? Come now. Half the townsfolk here are hunters. They're all scarred from animal bites and scratches. Norvind has wolves, bears, anything can happen. But yes, the initiation ritual for Tendris' servants is said to involve a werewolf's bite. I'm a man of science, as you know. It could be that its saliva contains some unknown virus. Hard to say. I've never seen the creature myself. But you've examined everyone in town. Haven't you found anything unusual? What would I look for? Birthmarks? Burns? Everyone has something unique to them. Basil sighed and took another swig of vodka. Do the legends say anything about a cure? Supposedly you must find the werewolf that bit you before sunset, cut out its heart and burn it. What a nightmare. Well, of course, it's a pagan legend. They only say that everyone the werewolf kills is a sacrifice to Tendris. So you understand he's no benevolent god. Dr. Dymirov finished the last of the vodka in his cup in one gulp, sniffed his sleeve, and rose from his chair. Well, Basil, you should rest today. I can see you're exhausted. You need some sleep. Basil nodded. Strangely, the alcohol hadn't really gone to his head, just made him feel a little drowsy. So he dragged himself over to the couch, collapsed onto it, and fell asleep instantly. The sound of boots on the wooden floor of the doctor's lounge woke him. Basil cracked his eyes open. It was already daylight, and 2 committee soldiers, rifles slung over their shoulders, were standing over him. "Good morning, Dr. Rykov," one of them greeted. "Sergeant Rachmanin. Commissioner Dragunin has ordered you to report to him immediately." "Very well. Let me get myself together." Basil washed up, combed his hair, changed into clean clothes, grabbed his pocket watch, and donned his coat and ushanka before following the soldiers to the commissioner. He had expected to be summoned. After all, he was the only one who had returned from the night expedition, so it was him who would have to answer for it. They put Basil into a car, one of the few in the area, and drove him straight to the building housing the city committee for safety. They passed through the new center of Nakhtumirsk, allowing Basil to admire the beauty of its modern architecture. The Ulni built dreary wooden houses, but here, stone grandeur, height, and scale. Ornamental moldings, wide windows, little balconies. The Rus population in Nakhtumirsk was still small, less than a quarter of the town, and consisted mainly of officials, engineers sent to work at the local pulp and paper mill, teachers, and committee members. All were assigned apartments here in the new district. Basil was also due to receive his own housing soon. Responsible for the city's safety was Commissioner Valerian Dragunin. He commanded a force of 200 soldiers, 3 of whom he'd already lost. Basil had found him entirely unsuited for such a position even yesterday, thin, curly-haired, with sparse, wispy mustache that made him look less masculine and more like a teenage boy, as if he were 18 rather than 30, his actual age. Too young, Basil had thought. And Dragunin's soft voice didn't help. Completely unsuited for a commander. When Basil was brought into his office, the commissioner was studying some papers with a pensive look. Basil glanced at the clock. 11 already. He had at best 5 or 6 hours left. Suppressing his anxiety, he stood straight and tall, clasping his hands behind his back. "Good morning, Dr. Rykov," the commissioner greeted without looking up from the papers. "Please have a seat." Basil sat down in the chair opposite Dragunin, who set the papers aside and turned his full attention to him. "I was informed this morning that you returned from the night expedition, but my men did not. What happened out there? I'm afraid you won't believe me. We'll see about that. Start talking and we'll sort it out." The commissioner's soft voice clashed with his sharp, no-nonsense manner of speaking. Basil unbuttoned his collar, loosening it as it suddenly felt too tight around his neck. "The local legends turned out to be true. The werewolf exists. I saw it with my own eyes." "Is that so?" Dragunin's voice betrayed no hint of surprise. "Go on. It killed your men. I'm very sorry. And how did you escape?" "I ran while it was preoccupied with them. I'm deeply ashamed of my cowardice, but better shame than death." The commissioner frowned. "Sergeant, leave us alone with the doctor." The soldiers left the room. Dragunin clasped his hands on the desk, staring at them as if holding something dangerous. "I hope you understand how bad your story sounds." His voice, though soft, grew firmer. "You're a man of science, rational by nature. Tell me what's easier to believe, that a magical creature called a werewolf exists, or that you killed my men and are now trying to feed me a tale to cover it up." Basil choked on the words forming in his throat, then began silently opening and closing his mouth like a fish, unable to find a response to such an absurd accusation. "I can take you to our camp," he finally managed. "You'll find the bodies and see for yourself that no man could have done such a thing. The werewolf tore them apart, literally into pieces." I don't know. You're a doctor. You're capable of many things." The commissioner rose from his chair and began pacing the room, eventually coming to stand behind Basil. "The bodies, or what's left of them, will need to be sent for examination. Here, the only one who could conduct such an examination besides you is Dr. Dymirov, who may very well cover for his new assistant. For a proper, independent analysis, they'll need to be sent to Nepryansk. Well, in the meantime, you'll sit here under lock and key. If the experts confirm it wasn't a person who did this, you'll be released immediately." Basil flinched, imagining what would happen when he turned into a werewolf in his cell later that night. A chill swept through him, a symptom of the transformation creeping closer. Unintentionally, he touched his forehead, which felt frighteningly cold. It seemed he'd have to lay all his cards on the table. "Fine. I have proof." Basil rolled up his sleeve, revealing the bandaged arm to the commissioner. Carefully, he unwrapped it, exposing the werewolf's bite marks. The commissioner let out a low whistle. "Looks like you ran into a bear. Well, all right. Let's say I believe you. What now?" "The legends say that a werewolf is a person who transforms into a beast at night." Basil rewrapped his arm as he spoke. "We need to figure out who it is. Dr. Dymirov mentioned that this mythical creature serves the local pagan god Tendris and bears some kind of mark. But I don't know what that mark is." The commissioner sank back into his chair, lost in thought. "I don't believe in all these fairy tales," he said. "But I admit it could be an elaborate trick, a con artist's ruse. There are two possibilities. Either a wild, dangerous animal is lurking in the forest and must be hunted down, or there's a murderer in the city who needs to be caught and brought to justice." "Sergeant." A few seconds later, the soldier who had escorted Basil, Sergeant Rachmanin, entered the office. "Take 5 men and head into the forest," the commissioner ordered. "You're to recover the bodies of our fallen comrades. The doctor will mark the location on the map for you. Here, doctor, please." "Yes. Circle it with a pencil." "There you go, Sergeant. Bring the bodies back to the city and deliver them to Dr. Dymirov for examination." "Is that clear?" "Understood." The sergeant left the office, closing the door behind him. "Now, Doctor, we'll investigate the possibility of a human culprit." The commissioner rose from his chair and walked over to a wardrobe. "I'll need you in case an examination is required. As for the mark, we'll ask Mogai, the local shaman. He knows more about these Tendrians than anyone else." The commissioner donned a winter officer's coat, fastened the belt with a revolver holster, and even attached a saber to his side. Basil couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the sight. Who still wore those? The oversized coat hung on the commissioner like a sack, making him look more like a schoolboy than an officer. They drove to the shaman's hut together. As they left the new part of the city and entered the old, Basil saw the true Nakhtumirsk in daylight for the first time. A battered rural road wound between wooden shacks covered in snow, making them resemble dugouts. The gray village houses blurred into a single, indistinct patch, and it seemed as though there had been no real life here before the blacks came to power, just endless wilderness. Dogs barked at the car from every yard as they passed. Along the way, the commissioner struck up a conversation sharing details about the town. The population was small, just over 4,000. There was only one school, built just 10 years ago. The same went for the hospital. Before it was constructed, Dr. Daimirov had treated patients in his own home. Apart from Daimirov and Basil, there were no other doctors in the city. The local Ulni mainly lived off hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding. Some worked at the factory, which had also been established only a decade ago. The commissioner had been assigned 5 years earlier. Basil learned that Dragoonin had joined the army at 18, fought in the Riemann War, and earned a medal for bravery after being wounded in battle. "And you, Doctor? What brought you here?" "I wanted to get as far from the capital as possible." Basil unconsciously began rubbing the locket around his neck. "A woman?" The commissioner's voice carried a trace of sympathy. "I see. I'd rather not talk about it." Mogai's hut stood on the outskirts, far from the rest of the town, almost at the edge of the Norvind wilderness. The car couldn't make it all the way, so they had to walk part of the journey. Deep snowdrifts and a biting wind made the trek difficult. After about 10 minutes, they were greeted by the barking of Mogai's dog, which darted out of its kennel as they approached the hut. To Basil's surprise, however, the dog didn't attack them. Instead, it greeted them warmly. At least it enthusiastically bounded up to the commissioner, who crouched down with a smile to scratch the dog behind the ear. "I've always gotten along well with dogs," he explained. After playing with the dog for a moment, they entered the hut. Mogai lived modestly, with little furniture, and even slept on the floor atop a simple mattress. It might be fine in the summer, Basil thought, but didn't he freeze in the winter? Still, the house had a stove, and Mogai was currently stoking its coals with a poker. Basil's attention, however, was drawn to the shelves neatly lined with jars of various herbs and mushrooms. He also noticed a basket of dried fly agarics in the corner and smirked knowingly. Mogai himself was short, wiry, and deeply wrinkled. His weathered skin was flushed red from exposure, and his long, ash-colored hair was tied into 2 braids. What surprised Basil most was his attire, a traditional long dress worn by Uln women. "What do you want?" Mogai's voice was unexpectedly powerful for such a small frame. "I'd like to introduce you to the new doctor," the commissioner said. "This is Basil Rykov. Basil, meet Mogai, our local shaman." "A pleasure." Basil offered a faint bow, unsure whether it was the appropriate gesture. "May Tendris guide you through the darkness," the shaman replied. "A beast, supposedly a werewolf, attacked the doctor last night. It even bit him on the arm. Show him, doctor, thank you." The commissioner gestured for Basil to roll up his sleeve. "According to your legends, this creature is a person who transforms into a wolf at night, a servant of Tendris, marked by him in some way. Can you tell us more about this?" Mogai finally tore himself away from his stove, set the poker down, and approached Basil. He grabbed Basil's arm roughly, inspecting the bandages, turning it over, and then looked him directly in the eyes. "My sympathies," the shaman said earnestly. "This is a heavy burden." "So, what about Tendris?" the commissioner reminded him. "I know what you're looking for," Mogai said. "Igomor Agzunov came to me a few hours ago. His dog died 3 days ago, and he hasn't gotten a new one yet. You might want to pay him a visit." "Interesting," the commissioner mused. "A unique case." Basil couldn't figure out what was so unique about someone's dog dying, but the commissioner seemed to think it was of great importance. So Basil decided not to ask any questions for now. At least not in front of the shaman. He didn't want to seem completely clueless. "Thank you for the lead," the commissioner said. "We'll look into it." After bidding Mogai farewell, they left the hut and returned to the car. Only after they were seated with the engine running did Basil finally work up the courage to speak. "Forgive me, Commissioner, but I don't understand," he admitted honestly. "What about the dog? What's going on?" "Local beliefs," the Commissioner explained. "You've noticed that all the Olney keep dogs? They believe dogs are the younger brothers of wolves, and by caring for them they honor Tendris. Werewolves rarely attack the Olney, and they think it's because of their dogs. Personally, I think it's nonsense. As for Igor Agzunov, he's a local hunter, and I know him well. He never goes anywhere without his dog. The fact that he hasn't replaced it after 3 days is, at the very least, suspicious. Either way, it's worth checking out." Basil found this explanation far from satisfying. A hunter's dog had died. So what? Why waste time on this when they urgently needed to find the werewolf? The clock was ticking and the sun was racing toward the western horizon. Meanwhile, dogs barked from every yard as their car passed, drowning out even the roar of the engine. The vehicle shook violently on the bumpy road, but the Commissioner drove with confidence, never stopping to ask for directions. Did he know all the town's residents by name? Then again, it wasn't surprising. His job required it. They soon arrived at an unassuming one-story house surrounded by a low wooden fence. A round-faced Uln man sat on a wooden bench near the gate, smoking a long pipe. Basil couldn't guess his age. He could have been 30 or 50. "Good day, Igor," the Commissioner called out. "Why the long face?" "Good day, Commissioner," the man replied. "I could tell you, but you wouldn't understand." "Why wouldn't I? I'm a pretty understanding guy. By the way, meet Basil Rykov, our new doctor." "Igor Agzunov," the Uln said, shaking Basil's offered hand with a firm, confident grip. "So, what's the trouble?" "My dog, Lakish, died a few days ago. I was going to go to the Shagarovs to get a new one. They had a litter about 6 months ago. But my daughter started acting up. She says she doesn't want a dog. Strange girl. I don't recognize her anymore." "What do you mean?" "It's like she's not my daughter at all. Like she's been swapped for someone else." Basil observed Igor's trembling fingers and unfocused eyes staring off into the distance. He remembered reading a paper by a Western psychiatrist about 4 years ago that described a syndrome where people failed to recognize their loved ones. What was the doctor's name? Something that sounded like Karga. No matter. Agzunov clearly needed help, but Basil didn't know the cause of the disorder or how to treat it. "We'll look into it," the Commissioner assured him. "We'll talk to Perugia." Agzunov nodded and continued smoking, staring distantly into the horizon. The Commissioner opened the gate and headed toward the house with Basil following. "He needs help," Basil said quietly as they walked along the path. "He has a serious psychological disorder." "Maybe," the Commissioner replied. "Or maybe something else is going on here. Let's talk to the girl and find out." The Commissioner unceremoniously opened the door and stepped inside. They found themselves in a bright, spacious entryway, and the Commissioner immediately moved further in. There, in a cramped kitchen, a girl of about 13 sat watching a pot of water slowly come to a boil on the stove. When the Commissioner and doctor entered, she flinched in fear, turned and stared at them in astonishment, her eyes darting back and forth between the two. "Hello, Perugia," Dragunin greeted her. "Do you know who I am?" "Uh-huh," the girl nodded. "You're the Commissioner." "Exactly, and this is our new doctor, Basil Rykov." "Hello, we've met before, haven't we?" The girl nodded again. "Met before?" the Commissioner asked, surprised. "Yes," Basil replied. "The day after I arrived, I started the scheduled health exams for the school children, so I've met most of the kids already. Perugia has excellent health. I remember that. The doctor gave the girl a kind smile, which she returned. The commissioner narrowed his eyes in suspicion. Excellent, you say? His tone carried a feigned attachment. Tell me, Perugia, do you remember your father's name? Igor? Correct. And do you know the name of our town? Nakhtamirsk. Very good. How about the country? The commissioner continued his questioning, as though hoping to catch her in a lie or a mistake. He seemed to be probing for any hint of falsehood. Basil stood by, baffled. It was obvious to him that the girl was perfectly fine, healthy and completely ordinary. He had personally examined her just 2 days ago, yet with each of her correct answers, the commissioner's frown deepened. All right, Perugia, Dragunin finally said, waving a hand dismissively. It seems everything's fine with you. Goodbye, and stay well. The commissioner was standing near the stove, close to the girl. As he turned to leave, his elbow struck a pot of boiling water, knocking it over. The pot tipped, sending scalding water cascading toward Perugia. She yelped and jumped back, but not before some of the water splashed onto her arm. She immediately wrapped the injured limb in a cloth, as though trying to stop bleeding. But burns don't work like that, Basil thought, rushing to help. Let me see your arm, he demanded, reaching toward her. It's fine, she said firmly. You were scalded. That's not fine. Don't worry, it barely touched me. It doesn't even hurt anymore. Then, suddenly, the commissioner stepped forward. The sound of a revolver's hammer cocking cracked through the air, and Basil froze as Dragunin leveled his weapon at Perugia. Show the doctor your arm, Dragunin ordered coldly, or I'll shoot you. Basil immediately placed himself between the girl and the gun, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. What are you doing? He asked, his voice trembling. Move, Dragunin barked, and his tone was so commanding that Basil stepped aside without thinking. Show us your arm, you creature. I'm counting to 3. 1, 2. Perugia let out a shriek that was neither girlish nor human. Basil and Dragunin stood frozen as her mouth opened wide, revealing elongated fangs. The whites of her eyes flooded with blood, and claws sprouted from her fingers. The cloth she'd used to cover her arm fell to the floor, revealing smooth, unblemished skin, free of any burns. In the next instant, Perugia hurled herself through the window, shattering the glass with her body. Outside, she landed on her feet and took off running down the road toward the forest. Dragunin clicked his tongue in frustration and holstered his revolver. After her, he commanded. We're not letting that thing escape. The broken window and the fleeing girl felt surreal to Basil, like fragments of a bizarre dream. None of it made sense. The commissioner threatening Perugia with a revolver, her blood-red eyes, her fangs, it was too much. He began to wonder if the legendary curse of the werewolf was already taking hold, poisoning his mind. Igor Aksunov burst into the room, shivering as the cold wind swept in through the broken window. May Tendris protect us, he murmured. So the legends are true. Dragunin ignored the hunter and headed for the door. Basil remained rooted to the spot, turning this way and that, unsure of what to do. At the threshold, the commissioner called out to him, snapping him back to reality. Basil followed reluctantly. As they climbed into the car, Igor ran out of the house with a rifle in hand. I'm coming with you. Igor, it's dangerous, Dragunin warned. She's my daughter. She's not your daughter anymore. I don't care. I know Norvin better than anyone. Fine. Get in. The commissioner started the car, turned it around, and drove in the direction of the forest, following Perugia's tracks in the snow. Basil's mind churned with questions, but he held them back, though curiosity and fear gnawed at him. This whole ordeal was far beyond anything he had expected. Moving to Noctumursk had been stressful enough, but a werewolf, Perugia, this was too much. He felt like he was losing his grip on who he was and what he was doing here. He had come seeking a quiet life, far from the chaos and great problems of the world. Instead, he'd stumbled into a nightmare he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "What's happening?" Basil finally asked, his voice distant and shaky. "The girl we saw, that wasn't Perugia Agzunov. That was a Yola. In our terms, a demon or malevolent spirit that takes on someone's appearance. Yola devour people and replace them." What nonsense is this? Basil couldn't believe that Dragonin, a man from the Black Army, a war veteran, could seriously spout such absurdities. Is this another local legend? "You saw it yourself, Doctor. Trust your eyes." Soon their car passed the edge of the town, and the road ended. A trail of small footprints led through the pristine snow, disappearing into the depths of the forest. "We're here," the commissioner announced, turning off the engine. "We go on foot from here?" They stepped out of the car, and Basil inhaled the crisp, frosty air, which helped clear his head. His thoughts began to steady, and his heart rate calmed. Dragonin carefully stepped into the snow, sinking almost to his knees. He gritted his teeth, raised his other leg, and took another step. "Leave it," Basil said. "You'll sink into the snow, soak through, and catch a cold. It's freezing. We're not going to catch her." "We must," the commissioner replied through clenched teeth. "Opportunities like this come once in a century." Agzunov hesitated briefly, then followed Dragonin into the snow. Basil stood and watched as they struggled through the deep drifts, their feet barely making progress. Meanwhile, Perugia's shallow tracks indicated that she had run across the snow as if it were solid ground. They would never catch her. Basil remembered the moment he had seen her inhuman face and heard that infernal screech. He realized that the chill outside wasn't as cold as the one inside him. What had the commissioner called her? Yola? And they eat people? That means the real Perugia Agzunov was already dead. At last, Basil understood. Dragonin, noble and selfless, was doing everything in his power to protect people from an unknown menace. The hunter Agzunov was driven by a desire to avenge his daughter's death. But what was Basil, a doctor, doing here? He had his own problems. The aching wounds on his arm were a constant reminder that he needed to find the werewolf, and Perugia was clearly not it. On the other hand, the display he had witnessed made it clear that Yola possessed inhuman strength. Dragonin and Agzunov could be seriously hurt in a confrontation, and they would need someone to provide first aid. Duty outweighed personal concerns. Basil stepped into the snow, following his companions. They trudged onward, carving a new path through the drifts. In the forest, the tracks eventually led to a narrow trail, making the journey easier. However, a new challenge arose. The trees grew closer together, threatening to close in and form an impenetrable wall. "My world has fallen apart, and you haven't even batted an eye," Basil said to Dragonin, who was leading the way, eyes fixed on the tracks. "And you interrogated Perugia so strangely, as if you knew all along this would happen. Admit it, Commissioner, you knew from the start." "Yes," Dragonin admitted without turning around. The single word carried a note of guilt. "Then why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? I've known about the Yola and Noctumursk for a long time, but distinguishing a real person from an imposter is almost impossible. Yola mimic every habit, memory, and mannerism. You can't catch them out in an interrogation. That's why I took the risk of scalding her with boiling water. The one thing they can't hide is their remarkable ability to heal instantly. And now what? We follow her to their lair. Once a month on the night of the new moon, the Yola gather for a feast, devouring all the people they've taken. Tonight is one such night. That's why I said this opportunity comes once in a century. Not only do we have a lead on where the Yola are likely hiding, but it's also the very day they gather. We could wipe them all out in one strike. And if not all, we'll at least learn who they are. Why the new moon? It's the night when the eye of Tendris, their mortal enemy, is closed. And what about Agzunov? His dog died, leaving the house unprotected. Dogs aren't much of a barrier to a hungry Yola, but these creatures avoid them anyway. That's why all the Ulni keep dogs. Most of them don't even remember why. They think it's to protect themselves from werewolves. And who's the werewolf? A warrior of Tendris. They hunt and destroy Yola to protect ordinary people. Behind them, Agzunov let out a sharp hiss. The hunter had been silent the whole way, and Basil had almost forgotten he was there. What was he thinking as he listened to Dragunen's explanation? Something wrong, Igomor. Those are Mogai's tales, Agzunov said darkly. And you believe them, Commissioner? That the killer of our loved ones is helping us? You can't be sure whether those people were human or disguised Yola, Dragunin replied. Exactly, I can't be sure. But I've known many of the dead my whole life. And now I'm supposed to believe they were Yola? The Commissioner shrugged. The tracks eventually led to a tall pine tree where they abruptly ended. Dragunin inspected the tree closely, noting claw marks and gouges in the bark. Looks like she climbed up and continued jumping from branch to branch. Is that even possible? Basil asked, astonished. For a Yola it is, Dragunin replied. She realized we were tracking her and decided to throw us off the trail. And how do we know where to go now? The Commissioner surveyed their surroundings, grunted with satisfaction, and turned left. Why that way? Basil asked. Most branches are covered with snow, but the ones she landed on are either bare or have noticeably less snow on them. You can see it most clearly in that direction, so logically that's where we need to go. In some places, dense underbrush blocked their path, forcing Dragunin to unsheathe his saber and hack at the branches to move forward. After 300 yards, they crossed a ravine and clambered over a pile of fallen trees. At that point, both Basil and Agzunov wanted to give up, but Dragunin firmly declared, "We must," and scrambled over the obstacles. An hour later, their clothes were caked with snow and dirt, and Basil's palms were raw, despite his good leather gloves. He feared they had gone too deep into Norvend and wouldn't be able to find their way back. But the Commissioner reassured him that he could navigate them out easily. The canopy of trees closed above them, blocking the sky, and the bright daylight was slowly smothered by encroaching evening darkness. Basil felt his chills intensify and suspected he might be running a fever. As they approached another thicket, Dragunin abruptly halted, crouched, and raised a fist, signaling the others to stop. He carefully parted the branches, and Basil peeked over his shoulder. On a wide, snow-covered clearing ahead, they saw Perugia, or rather the thing she had become. She no longer resembled a normal human. Her mouth stretched nearly from ear to ear, her skin had turned gray, and her elongated arms and legs were grotesquely disproportionate to the rest of her body. Her clothes were torn in places, but the Yola didn't seem to feel the cold at all. Perugia was performing some sort of ritual. She slashed a vein on her left arm with her claw, let her blood drip onto the snow, and muttered something under her breath. "Pass me the rifle, Igomor." Dragunin whispered. "We'll take her out now." But before the commissioner could act, Aksunov unshouldered his rifle and aimed it at Dragunin. The commissioner noticed and raised his hands, slowly rising to his feet. Basil instinctively took a few steps back, realizing he wasn't seen as a threat. "I'm here, Perugia," Aksunov shouted loudly. "Your father is here." The Yola immediately stopped whispering and turned to face them. "What are you doing, Igomor?" Dragunin growled through gritted teeth. "That creature will kill us all." "Shut up!" the hunter roared, punctuating his words with a gunshot. The commissioner cried out and fell to the ground. Basil seized the momentary confusion to lunge at the hunter, trying to wrest the rifle from him. But Aksunov struck him in the jaw with the butt of the weapon. The world spun. Light turned to darkness with flashes of fire. The pain was distant. Basil's consciousness slipping away as his body collapsed into the snow. Aksunov, meanwhile, emerged from the cover directly toward the Yola. "Don't be afraid, my girl," he shouted. "I've dealt with them. They won't hurt you anymore." The Yola, now looking exactly like Perugia again, ran up to him. "Thank you, Daddy," it said, wrapping its arms around the hunter's neck. In the next instant, the Yola ripped Aksunov's head from his body and sank its teeth into the torn neck. Blood splattered across the girl's face as grotesque, wet sounds of feasting echoed through the forest. Basil came to and saw the creature tearing chunks of flesh from the hunter's corpse with its teeth. His stomach twisted as if clutched by an iron fist, but he fought back the nausea, sprang to his feet, and ran toward Dragunin. Survival instincts drove him now. If he didn't act, the Yola would devour him too. His only option was to grab a weapon and fight. But the creature bounded forward in 2 leaps, blocking his path. Basil screamed, throwing up his arms as if they could protect him. The Yola hissed ferociously and lunged at him, but stopped suddenly. A steel saber blade jutted from its open mouth. Dragunin had regained consciousness and saved Basil at the last moment. The Yola, however, wasn't finished. With a sharp movement, it let the blade slice through half its head and turned, slashing at the commissioner with its claws. Dragunin managed to leap back, but heard the whistle of claws slicing through the air. He swung the saber upward in a desperate attempt to fend off the creature, but it seemed unfazed by the strike. Black blood sprayed into the air as the Yola, now cleaved from its right side to its left shoulder, launched itself at Dragunin and pinned him to the ground. The creature opened its gaping maw and sank its fangs into Dragunin's shoulder. He screamed, struggling to push the Yola off, but it was futile. The monster drank greedily, slurping his blood. Then, abruptly, the Yola recoiled, smoke pouring from its mouth. It stared at its hands in confusion as its face began to melt from its skull. "You!" it roared furiously, glaring at Dragunin. "It's you?" In the next moment, its head fell from its body and landed in the snow. The rest of its form crumpled to the ground. Exhausted and injured, Dragunin lowered his saber, sheathed it, and stumbled to a nearby tree. Leaning his back against it, he slid to the ground. Basil rushed to his side. His face throbbed with pain, his head spun, and a strange ringing echoed in his skull, but his instincts as a doctor took over. The commissioner had done his duty. Now Basil had to fulfill his own. "Don't move," Basil instructed, beginning to unfasten Dragunin's coat. The commissioner caught his hand. "No need. It will heal soon." "You've got buckshot lodged in your shoulder. It needs to be removed, the wounds cleaned, and bandaged. And that creature bit you. You've lost a lot of blood. In this cold, that's deadly. We have to get you back to the city. But I don't think I can manage on my own." I have tweezers, alcohol, and bandages with me, Basil said. I always carry them just in case. I need to at least give you some first aid so you can make it back on your own. I'll make it, Dragoonin replied. Don't worry. It's already getting late, you see. He pointed upward. Basil looked up, but had difficulty spotting the sky through the thick canopy of trees. It did seem to be getting darker. The doctor pulled out his pocket watch from under his coat. 4 o'clock, another hour, and it would be over. You need to find your werewolf, Dragoonin said. Why didn't you stay in the city? You could have. Basil fully unbuttoned the commissioner's coat and started working on his uniform. Because I'm a doctor, and you might have needed help. Duty comes before personal problems. Dragoonin let out a strained laugh, which quickly turned into a wince of pain from his wounds. I see. Yes, I suppose that's how it had to be. People like you and me have only one path. I'd forgotten. He chose you himself. Who's he? Tendris. Basil, now unfastening Dragoonin's uniform jacket, paused momentarily. It was me who bit you, Doctor, Dragoonin admitted. I suspected as much. The commissioner smirked and closed his eyes. Forgive me. Tendris commanded it. It's hard to explain, but I felt an overwhelming urge to do it. Apparently, he decided I needed an assistant. But don't worry. You'll be fine. You won't turn. I won't? Basil froze, his hands gripping the unbuttoned shirt collar. Your silver locket, Dragoonin said. Silver is the only thing that can wound a werewolf. Thankfully, there's little of it in Noctumursk. As long as you keep the locket on all night without taking it off, by dawn the curse will be gone without a trace. But it only works on the first night. If you transform, there's no going back. So, I just need to keep my locket on all night, that's it? That's it. Dragoonin smiled, and for some reason that smile deeply moved Basil. In that moment, the commissioner, a hardened soldier with a youthful face and thin, scraggly mustache, seemed profoundly kind and genuine. Looking at him now, it was impossible to imagine that this man had been waging a secret war against otherworldly creatures for years, with the people around him none the wiser. Basil finally exposed Dragoonin's shoulder, pulled a small bottle of medical alcohol from his coat pocket, and poured some over the wounds. Then he disinfected the tweezers with the alcohol and began extracting the buckshot. Dragoonin grimaced but endured the pain silently. Once night falls, I'll transform, and the wounds will heal instantly. You're wasting your efforts, Dragoonin said. I doubt you want to keep buckshot lodged in your shoulder. It would have been pushed out eventually, but thank you nonetheless. I appreciate your concern. You're a good man, Doctor. Forgive me for having to kill those 3 in front of you. They were all Yola. That's why I sent them on the hunt in the forest. If I hadn't arrived in time, they would have killed and replaced you. That would have made my job even harder. Then I'm glad you showed up in time, Basil replied. Now hold still. Basil removed the last piece of buckshot, doused the wounds with alcohol again, and began bandaging them. Wasting bandages, Dragoonin muttered. Better than you bleeding out before sunset. And let's not forget the risk of infection. You're a doctor through and through, Dragoonin said. How did you end up in our backwater town? Basil sighed deeply. Perhaps it was the moment, or maybe the day's events, but he found himself telling Dragoonin everything. He spoke of how since childhood he had been in love with Ksenia Miranina, a classmate. How one summer he had picked flowers from the school garden, almost getting caught, just to give her a modest bouquet. How for years he hadn't been able to confess his feelings, as doing so felt like stepping into a black abyss. Maybe it wasn't deep, but the chance of a deadly fall was always there. Basil had been too careful with his emotions, guarding his fragile heart and chastising himself for his sensitivity and vulnerability. Eventually, it led to the inevitable. Vicinia fell in love with someone else. A soldier, of course. At the time, Basil was in his final year of university and doing a practicum at the base where this bold, handsome lieutenant, Iskander Kurazin, was stationed. Kurazin, decisive and commanding, confessed his feelings to Vicinia just a week after meeting her, and was met with mutual affection. Since Basil was friends with both, he had no choice but to watch their happiness, clenching his fists in frustration at everyone, and especially himself, for not being the one to kiss her instead of Kurazin. And then, Basil continued, finishing the bandage and refastening Dragunin's coat. A soldier deserted from the base. He took a rifle with him, and Kurazin tried to stop him. For his trouble, he took a bullet. Right here, just near the heart. The hospital was too far away. He would have bled out before they could get him there. He needed surgery on the spot. But the base doctor, my superior, was a hopeless drunk. That evening he was so intoxicated that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake him. You have to understand, Commissioner. At that moment, Basil continued, I could have easily solved my problem. I had no right to operate. I was just an intern. Kurazin was on the brink of death, and I could have stayed by Vicinia's side to comfort her. Sure, my superior would have gone to prison, but he'd have deserved it. A doctor shouldn't drink himself into such a state. But you saved him, didn't you? Dragunin asked. Yes, Basil admitted. The commissioner smiled. That's why Tendris chose you. Selflessness. That's his mark. You and I, we do what's right not because we expect a reward. There won't be one. Most of the time, no one will even thank us. We do it because we can't act any other way. No matter how hard or painful it is, you'll shoulder it all because that's who you are. Basil nodded. I don't mean to brag, but for an intern, I performed a brilliant operation. We made it look like my superior saved Kurazin. Otherwise, both of us would have faced consequences. But I couldn't stay there after that. I finished my studies and requested an assignment somewhere far away. That's how I ended up in Nakhtumirsk. It's fate, Doctor. And now? We wait for nightfall. From the looks of it, this is the entrance to the Yola's hidden lair, where they keep their captives for their feasts. When they gather, I'll attack and try to take them all down at once. If I succeed, I'll not only rid the town of them, but also save the captives. Maybe then the people of Nakhtumirsk will see that the werewolf isn't their enemy. A few years ago, I made a mistake. I let one Yola escape. Just one, Doctor. And I'm still paying for it. As you've seen, people can't accept that their loved ones might be man-eating monsters, even when it's right before their eyes. The Yola cloud their minds, make them willing to die for them. If it's not too much trouble, could you hide the Akzunov's bodies and cover the bloody tracks with snow? Basil spent the remainder of the daylight hours on the task. Despite his efforts, it wasn't perfect. A quick glance could tell someone had been there, but not who. Satisfied with his work, he returned to find Dragunin standing on his feet. The commissioner's pupils had turned yellow. His hands were covered in thick black fur. Sideburns had grown out, and his nose had taken on a more animalistic shape. Basil was initially startled, but then realized Dragunin must still be in control, even in his altered state. You haven't fully transformed. There's no need for that yet. In the beginning, I would transform completely as soon as night fell, but over time, I accepted the wolf's essence and can now restrain it. I've only let the wolf out enough to heal the wounds. Basil was astonished to find that Dragunin's injuries were indeed gone. He mentioned his own chills and the feverish feeling creeping up. but Dragonin reassured him that it was simply the beast within trying to surface. "Don't take off your locket," he said, "and it'll pass by morning." They waited in their hiding spot for another hour before the Yola arrived. It was pitch dark, and Basil couldn't see a thing, but Dragonin seemed to navigate effortlessly. All Basil could hear were hushed whispers in an unfamiliar language. Then he saw a sudden tear in the darkness, as if it had been cut open with a knife. A dim bluish light poured from the opening, and shadows slipped inside and vanished. "Stay here," Dragonin commanded. "This isn't your fight. When I'm done, I'll lead you and the survivors back to the city." He darted out of their hiding spot, shifting into the werewolf Basil had seen the night before as he ran. Like the other shadows, he disappeared into the glow, and silence fell. Basil was left alone in the darkness. He reached down and felt something soft beneath his hand. Dragonin's clothes, discarded before his transformation. In the cold, Basil clumsily folded them and set them beside him to take back later. The freezing night wind bit through his coat, so he wrapped himself in Dragonin's jacket to stay warm. An unshakable sense of unease gnawed at him. What if Dragonin couldn't handle it? Basil hadn't gotten a clear look, but there had been at least 10 Yola. The werewolf had barely managed 3 the night before, and Basil had seen firsthand what just one could do. Even a small one like Perugia. Still, the Yola were vulnerable to the werewolf's blood, which offered some hope. But they weren't fools. What if Dragonin needed help? The commissioner had left his pistol and saber behind. But what could human weapons do? Perugia had only died when her head was severed. All Dragonin's other strikes had been ineffective. Basil couldn't just sit there, helpless. His pride wouldn't allow it. He groped in the dark until he found the pistol, saber, and Ogzunov's rifle, then crept cautiously toward the glowing rift. The rift was a strange, two-dimensional slice in space, invisible from certain angles. Basil circled it, marveling at the wonders of the world. Science, which had once seemed so engaging, now felt dry and uninspired in comparison. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the rift. On the other side, he found himself in what appeared to be ancient, monumental ruins. Above, a luminous mist swirled like clouds lit by eternal lightning. The walls were adorned with bas-reliefs inscribed with unknown writing and depictions of battles from bygone eras. Basil moved forward down a broken stone corridor, his footsteps echoing loudly. The glowing mist provided enough light to see, but the Yola were fast and dangerous. Who knew when one might leap from the shadows? He checked Ogzunov's rifle. It had 1 shot left. That would have to do. Raising the rifle, Basil pressed on. From somewhere ahead came the sounds of heavy thuds, cries, scraping, groaning, and animalistic growls. The fight was in full swing. Basil dashed forward, reasoning that the Yola were too preoccupied to notice him. Soon the tunnel opened into a vast, high-ceilinged hall. At its center stood a massive marble table surrounded by equally imposing chairs. In the far left corner, a colossal tree grew directly out of the stone floor, its canopy disappearing into the glowing mist above. Around its thick roots lay headless human bodies, with severed heads scattered haphazardly nearby. Basil couldn't tell if they were Yola or their captives. The werewolf commissioner was locked in combat with 4 creatures that scarcely resembled humans anymore. Their elongated limbs made them seem grotesque and disproportionate. Triangular ears like those of Jerboas protruded from their heads. Rows of sharp teeth had replaced their human ones. Their skin had turned gray, and their blood-filled eyes gleamed menacingly. Yet Basil could still discern traces of their former humanity. He even recognized 2 of them, Bulakin, a visiting engineer, and Totsky, a teacher. When Basil's gaze landed on the third Yola, a chill ran down his spine, as if death had passed dangerously close. His current superior, Dr. Ringo Daimirov, was among them. Just this morning, they'd been having a calm conversation about how to break the werewolf's curse by killing it and burning its heart. Now Basil understood why Daimirov had supported his idea of going into the forest with the 3 soldiers last night. The werewolf fought desperately, fending off the Yola that kept leaping onto his back. They slashed at him with their claws, while he tried to snap at them with his jaws, but his teeth only met empty air. Basil could see that Dragunin was struggling. He was severely wounded, and his injuries weren't healing. Only later did Basil notice the silver knife in Bulakin's hand, which left small but effective cuts on the werewolf. Basil pressed himself against the wall. Could he do anything to help the commissioner? Shooting a Yola with the rifle wouldn't kill it, but it might buy some time. The creatures moved quickly, striking and then darting away before Dragunin's powerful jaws and claws could catch them. If the commissioner could take out even one of them, the fight would shift in his favor. Bulakin seemed the best target. He had the knife. Summoning his courage, Basil raised the rifle and stepped into the passageway, trying to aim. No, it was impossible. The Yola moved too fast. Basil realized with horror that the only way to help would be to join the fight himself. But in the chaos, he'd surely be torn apart. As he hesitated, Dragunin sank his teeth into Totsky's neck, ripping off his head with a powerful tug. But at that moment, Bulakin leaped onto the werewolf's back and drove the knife into him. Dragunin roared in pain and spun violently, throwing the monster off. Despite the knife protruding from his back and the blood streaming from numerous wounds, he attacked the remaining Yola with renewed ferocity, scattering them in fear. Basil noticed too late that Dr. Daimirov was charging straight toward him. He ducked into the shadows behind the wall just in time to avoid being seen. Daimirov rushed past him and disappeared. Meanwhile, a fourth, unfamiliar Yola jumped onto Dragunin's back, pulled out the knife and stabbed him several more times. The commissioner managed to throw the creature off, slam it to the ground, tear off its arms, and bite off its head. Bulakin had vanished, likely fleeing through another passage. The battle was over. Exhausted, the werewolf staggered to the table, leaned against it, and then collapsed onto the floor beside it. Basil scanned the room, saw no immediate threat, and rushed to help. He quickly assessed Dragunin's injuries and realized there was no hope. The commissioner had suffered too many cuts and lost too much blood. In Dragunin's yellow, wolfish eyes, Basil saw bitterness and sorrow. Tears welled in his own eyes as he understood he could do nothing for the man he had grown to respect so deeply in a single day. Now Basil knew the truth. The werewolf was indeed a protector. He had seen with his own eyes how fiercely Dragunin had fought the monsters that preyed on the people of Nakhtumirsk. And now, with a heavy heart, he watched as the commissioner's tears mingled with his labored, dying breaths. With his last strength, Dragunin raised a hand to point at his chest, near his heart, and then at his mouth. Basil understood the gesture and wanted to object, but it was too late. Dragunin's breathing slowed and then stopped. His eyes lost their focus, glazing over as they stared into eternal emptiness. Basil let his tears flow freely. Was this the end? The captives appeared to be dead, and 2 Yola had escaped. Dragunin had sacrificed his life, but failed to achieve his goal. The monsters still lived, and Nakhtumirsk had no defender left. Sure, Basil now knew who among the townsfolk were Yola, but what of it? He didn't have the courage to kill them, knowing their strength. And he couldn't convince the townspeople that their neighbors were man-eating monsters. They'd think him mad. Basil Rykov could do nothing. The idea of taking Dragonin's place terrified him. The thought of turning into a beast each night, fighting monsters and ultimately dying from their claws, like the commissioner, was unbearable. He could forget all of this, drink himself into oblivion, and continue working under Damirov as if nothing had happened. But every night he'd tremble in fear, wondering when the Yola would come for him. But that wasn't his path. As he knelt by his fallen comrade, tears streaming down his face, Basil understood he couldn't abandon the people to their fate. He had been destined from birth to serve Tendris, and now the moon god demanded he step up to protect Nakhtumirsk. Selflessness, Basil thought. That is Tendris's mark. He wiped his tears, rose, and walked to the bodies lying by the tree in the corner. Here were the real Totsky and the unknown man. But when Basil saw the other corpses, his heart nearly stopped. They were children. 5 decapitated children. Among them was Puruja Agzunov. The stench of decay and rot filled the air, and their torn abdomens spilled entrails, tangled among the blood-soaked roots. Basil's chills grew stronger, his fever worsening, and his body weakening. Yet he knelt before the bodies and picked up one of the heads, examining it closely. A boy about 12 years old. So young, yet already a victim of these monsters. Basil thought he recognized the boy. Tainin? He vaguely remembered him from a checkup, but scrutinized the face carefully, committing every feature to memory. Then he moved to the next head. One by one, Basil memorized them all. Now he knew whom to look for in the town, but many hadn't come to tonight's feast, which meant others in Nakhtumirsk were also Yola. Damirov's body wasn't here, after all. Well, Basil thought, the fight isn't over yet. Basil returned to the werewolf's body, picked up the silver knife lying nearby, and steeled himself. With trembling hands, he cut into the beast's chest, carefully extracting the lifeless heart. A nauseating stench filled his nostrils, and he fought the urge to retch. Summoning his resolve, he bit into it with all his strength. The moment the first chewed piece reached his stomach, Basil's mind was flooded with visions of the ancient war between Tendris and the Yola. He saw the lives of past werewolves, inherited their spirits and wills, and was consumed by their rage. Their knowledge and experience poured into him, giving him the strength to continue their battle. When the heart was gone, Basil stripped himself bare, leaving only his silver locket. For a final time he touched it with his fingers, feeling a faint electric tingle. Opening it, he gazed upon Vasinia's face, beautiful as always, beautiful and forever out of reach. Goodbye, be happy. He tore the locket from his neck and cast it aside. Instantly his body began to transform. Hair sprouted over his skin, which stretched and thickened. His fingers widened, claws grew from his nails, and his hands and feet reshaped into wolfish paws. Though he remained upright, he knew he could move faster on all fours. His senses sharpened as his face extended into a snout. Basil Rykov ceased to exist. The werewolf had returned. The world transformed around him. Sounds became sharp and distinct, smells vivid and layered. Colors faded, but shapes stood out starkly even in darkness. Basil bolted for the exit, marveling at the ease with which his new form moved. In one bound, he cleared several yards. When he reached the stone tunnel's end, the dimensional rift behind him sealed itself, closing like a healed wound. But Basil no longer cared. His heart burned with hatred, his every instinct screaming for vengeance against the Yola. He couldn't rest until every last one was destroyed. The journey back to Nakhtumirsk was effortless. His powerful limbs plowed through snowdrifts like feathers, and he vaulted over fallen trees with ease. What had taken hours before now took half the time. As the first houses appeared in the distance, a loud command rang out. Fire! Gunshots echoed, and Basil felt a sharp pain in his shoulder that quickly faded. Reload! Faster! Another volley followed, this time hitting his chest. Basil staggered, wheezing for a moment, but soon the pain subsided. Then he heard a voice, Bullekin's. It was clear and distinct amid the cacophony of gunfire, shouting and stomping feet. With a ferocious roar, Basil charged toward the sound, plowing into the line of armed Nakhtumirsk townsfolk. Soldiers and hunters froze in fear, their faces pale with near-superstitious terror. Basil ignored them, focusing on the bitter, rotting scent of the Yola. He leapt at Bullekin, who tried to dodge, but the werewolf's jaws clamped down on his neck. In front of a dozen horrified onlookers, Basil ripped off Bullekin's head and tossed it aside. He let out a roar so powerful that it silenced the crowd, their hearts seemingly stopping in their chests. Now it was Demirov's turn. Basil tore toward the doctor's home, ignoring the shouted commands behind him. Another round of gunfire followed, but the bullets missed, whistling past his ears. Basil knew how this looked. A monstrous beast ripping a townsman apart. But after witnessing the horrors the Yola committed, he couldn't allow even one of them to exist. His only goal was to destroy them all. The werewolf smashed through Demirov's gate, tearing it from its hinges, and barreled into the house. He moved through the narrow corridor with ease, guided by his sharpened senses. Demirov was sitting in a chair in one of the cramped rooms. As soon as he saw the beast, he hissed and lunged, claws aiming for Basil's throat. Basil dodged, biting into Demirov's arm and tearing it off. In the next instant, he tore off the doctor's head as well. A quick career move, Basil thought grimly. Jumping through the window, he found the townsfolk already gathered outside, weapons at the ready. He didn't wait for them to shoot, darting away before they could fire. The hardest task lay ahead, entering 4 homes to kill the children. After this, no one would ever forgive him, but he had no choice. Every moment of hesitation would lead to more human deaths, and every mistake would carry a heavy price. Basil raced through the town, weaving through the maze of homes and alleys to lose his pursuers. He quickly found the first house, leaping through a window to find the small demon child. Without hesitation, he bit off its head. The second house was guarded by the boy's family. Basil pushed past them, reaching his target. The third and fourth homes were easier. He used the same method, jumping through windows to dispatch the young Yola swiftly. Each kill left him haunted by the memories of the real children, their severed heads, their gruesome final moments. He heard the monstrous screams of the dying Yola, and imagined the heartbreak their parents would feel when they discovered what he had done. Yet even this was better than what the Yola had done to their real children. Basil left the fourth house and headed toward Norvund, but the voices of townsfolk reached him again. A shot rang out, and searing pain lanced through his shoulder. This time, it didn't fade. Silver. Someone had taught the townsfolk to use silver. Basil fled in panic, the angry cries of the townspeople echoing behind him. "Don't let him escape!" Basil kept running, blindly pushing forward. Pain pulsed through his torn shoulder, and drops of his blood splattered onto the snow, leaving a clear trail for his hunters to follow. The voices behind him gradually faded into the distance. He leapt over a fallen tree, changed direction, and trudged on. His vision began to blur. He'd lost too much blood. Each step became harder than the last, until finally he came to a halt and collapsed into the snowbank. He lay on his back, staring up at the moonless night sky as soft snowflakes drifted down onto his muzzle. He wanted to die. Killing children, even if they were monsters, was too much to bear. to carry the weight of universal hatred, to spend his life in endless battles against the Yola. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps nearby broke through the quiet. Basil was too exhausted to care. If it was a hunter, he wished they would just shoot him and end it all. But when a familiar face loomed over him, that of the shaman Mogai, he felt a deep guttural urge to howl in despair. "Praise to you, warrior of Tendris," Mogai said, his voice calm and reverent. "Hold on, I'll help you." With those words, the shaman grasped Basil's massive forepaw and, using all his strength, began dragging him through the snow. "My hut isn't far. I'll give you special herbs. Treat and bandage your wounds. You'll rest for a couple of days and regain your strength." Basil closed his eyes, surrendering to fate. "Don't despair, warrior. Very soon you'll be ready to continue your service to the great Tendris."